Chapter 1163. Being invited to a meal by Jiang of Silla, in the entire capital, there were only a few people who had this kind of qualification. What these young people felt at this moment was naturally not that they were overwhelmed by the favor, but that they were terrified. They were extremely regretful in their hearts. Why did they have to join in the fun today? At this moment, they were in a dilemma, but they did not dare to block the way, and they all retreated to the corner. And the servants accompanying them hurriedly left. As for the young scholar with a swollen face, his face was already ashen, paralyzed on the ground, and even his lips could not move. Li looked back at the fatty and said, "Do you want to sit down and eat together?" "No need, no need." Peng Er hurriedly shook his head and said, "Thank you, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." Sitting at this table, one was Princess Shaning, and the other was His Highness Jiang of Silla. The matter of him selling fake test papers to His Highness Jiang of Silla was enough for him to brag for a lifetime. Eating at the same table with His Highness Jiang of Silla and Princess Shaning. What virtue or ability did he, Fatty Peng, have? Even the smoke on his ancestral grave did not dare to emit like this. Li no longer forced him. He looked at him and said, "You can be considered to have hands and feet. If you use your mouth to do business, you will definitely not lose money. In the future, it is better to do less of this kind of thing." The woman next to Peng Er knelt in front of Li Yi and hurriedly said, "Brother Peng sold fake test papers just to treat my seriously ill mother. Please forgive him this time, Your Highness. We will definitely return the money in the future." He was wrong to sell fake test papers, but those who intend to cheat are not righteous people. Li Yi waved his hand and said, "In the future it will be fine." Peng Er nodded and said, "I will definitely remember Your Highness Jiang of Silla's teachings." Li looked at him and suddenly asked, "Are you interested in working at Jiang of Silla's residence?" He had had 2 brief encounters with Peng Er. Although his act of reselling fake exam papers seemed to be beneath him, the fact that he was able to stand out among all the fake exam dealers in the capital and successfully attract so much hatred showed that he still had a lot of redeeming qualities. After all, there were so many unscrupulous dealers in the capital who sold fake test papers, but he was the only one who was beaten on the street. This kind of person was born to do business. After they left this time, the Li family still needed a reliable person to take care of the business. This Peng Er would be of great use if he was properly trained. Peng Er was stunned at first, but after he realized it, he immediately knelt on the ground and said, "Li family of Li family, Your Highness Jiang Silla, Your Highness, Your Highness." Li Yi waved his hand and motioned for Peng Er to get up. A middle-aged man in official robes walked in from the door. He tidied up his clothes and said respectfully, "This lowly official is the capital's magistrate Linda. Greetings, Your Highness Jiang of Silla and Princess Shaning." When Li Yi left, the capital's magistrate was still Lu Dayo. Now that Lu Dayo had become the capital governor, this new magistrate was a new face. His face was a bit frightened as he said, "This lowly official was not strict enough and alarmed Your Highness. Please punish me." Li looked at this magistrate and asked, "Fighting in the street with no regard for human life, what about the law?" The middle-aged man looked at the young man with a swollen face and immediately said, "Your Highness, rest assured, this lowly official will investigate this case and punish it according to the law." Li looked at Shaning and asked, "Are you full?" Shaning nodded and said, "I'm full." Li stood up and looked at the magistrate and said, "I'll leave this to Magistrate Lin." The magistrate immediately bowed and said, "Your Highness, please rest assured." Li Yi waved at Qin He and said, "Let's go." "Send off Your Highness." The magistrate immediately bowed and said, "Take care, Your Highness." Li Yi and Shaning walked out of the restaurant and parted ways with Peng Er and the woman. They walked towards the Jiang of Silla's residence. In this big capital, there were not many people who could talk to him nicely. Qin He was one of them. Although he lived like a beast, he was also free and easy. He immersed himself in his own world and didn't care about the outside world. He was a smart person who could see through the world. At the entrance of the restaurant, Wu Er looked in the direction Li Yi disappeared in before looking away. Wu Er scratched his head and murmured, "His Highness seems different from before, but I can't tell what's different." Qin He smiled and said, "In the past, His Highness Jiang of Silla was like a sharp sword, showing off its edge. The current His Highness is still a sword, just that he has hidden the edge of the sword. Wu scratched his head. Although he still didn't understand, he was used to Fifth Lord not speaking human language. When they walked into the restaurant, the magistrate walked up and said with a smile, "I'll get someone to compensate for the restaurant's loss. There's no need for it to be doubled, just compensate at the original price." He waved his hand and said, "Thank you in advance, magistrate." The magistrate's heart skipped a beat. This restaurant manager and Jiang of Silla seemed to be familiar with each other. His background should not be small. A smile appeared on his face again and he said, Of course. After walking out of the restaurant, most of the young masters heaved a sigh of relief. They wiped the cold sweat off their foreheads and felt like they had survived a disaster. One of them heaved a long sigh of relief and said, "Fortunately, we didn't offend Jiang of Silla." It said that a few years ago, when Jiang of Silla wasn't Jiang of Silla, many young masters of the top families in the capital city were dragged to the palace gates to be flogged because they offended him. They couldn't get out of bed for a few months. There was another time when more than 10 important officials of the imperial court had to personally go to a restaurant to retrieve their juniors. It could be said that they were completely humiliated. As the crowd heaved a sigh of relief, they looked at one person in the crowd and said gratefully, "Thank you for reminding us just now, Brother Zheng. Otherwise, this would have led to a disaster." The young man they called Brother Zheng was still pale. He looked at them and said with a trembling voice, You think it's over?" He wiped the sweat on his palms on his clothes. These people had not experienced some things, so how would they know the fear of the entire capital city being dominated by Jiang of Silla? This was not the end, but just the beginning. Jiang of Silla had returned. This capital city would probably experience another huge shock. In a certain official's mansion, an official who had just rushed home looked at his son and asked in horror, "Did you have a conflict with Jiang of Silla just now?" No conflict. The young man immediately said, "We just went to watch the show. We definitely didn't have a conflict with His Highness Jiang of Silla." "Watch the show?" The official picked up a bamboo stick and hit him. He said angrily, "Is His Highness Jiang of Silla's show something you can watch?" The young man looked at him and said tentatively, "Father Jiang of Silla." Jiang of Silla didn't say anything and just let us leave. Nothing big happened, right? "What do you know?" The middle-aged man glared at him again and immediately walked out of the room. He said loudly, "Someone prepare a generous gift, the thicker the better." At the same time, many official residences in the capital city had carriages full of gifts and were gathering in the same direction. Shui Mansion. Old General Shui drank the wine in his bowl and laughed. "Little brat, every time you come back, you cause such a big commotion. You don't even know to come to the Shui Mansion to take a look." An old woman poured him another bowl of wine and said, "His Highness Jiang of Silla's status is different now. When you see him, you can't act like this again." "What's wrong with Jiang of Silla again?" Old General Shui curled his lips and said, "I lent the pillar that Jiang of Silla slept on when he went to court." Xing Mansion. On this day, Sung Shichen, who was already the Minister of Revenue, changed into casual clothes and walked out of the mansion. Capital Governor's Mansion. On this day, Capital Governor Lu Dayo did not bring any attendants with him, and hurriedly left. Chapter 1164. Since returning to the capital, Li had been staying with the Li family, and had not returned to the Jiang of Silla estate. Today, the main gate of the Jiang of Silla estate was open for the first time in several years. In front of the gate, there was an endless stream of carriages and sedan chairs. Most people put down their gifts and left in a hurry without even stepping through the gate. In the past few years, the Jiang of Silla estate had only left a few servants to clean the courtyard. This time, the officials and nobles of the capital had gathered, and the servants in the estate were somewhat overwhelmed. Shanning simply transferred some of the maids and servants from her princess residence over just to help them carry the gifts. Of course, not everyone put down their gifts and passed through the gate without entering. "Where's Zimo and Xiaomu?" This was the first thing Seng Shichen said after seeing Li Yi. Li Yi shook his head and said, "They're in Rui City. They didn't come back this time." Seeing the anticipation and excitement on Seng Shichen's face disappear in an instant, Li glanced at Li Yi and said indifferently, "You're back." A mere minister of revenue dared to speak to him like this. After not seeing each other for a few years, Lord Sung had become a lot more arrogant. However, for the sake of Zemo and Xiaomu, Li did not argue with him for his lack of manners for the time being. Lu Dao walked over quickly with an excited expression on his face and said, "Your Highness, you're back." Lord Lu's attitude was much better than his predecessors by many times. It's been 2 months since Yizhong left the capital to investigate the unjust cases. I'm afraid he won't be back in a short time. Lu Dao looked at Li Yi and said with some regret, "He must be very happy to know that Your Highness has returned to the capital." Hearing Lu Yizhong's name, Sung Shichen looked at him and couldn't help but say, "Your Anxi County is really full of talents." Old Sung was right. Lu Dao had originally been the magistrate of Anxi County. In less than 10 years, he had climbed to the position of the capital governor. He had reached the pinnacle of being a local official. As for Lu Yi, he had been promoted from an insignificant constable to the current Minister of Justice. His position was the same as Sung Shichen's. He could be called a legend in the bureaucracy. The former magistrate of Qing and Dong Wenyun was now the Minister of the Right. The former Anxi County lieutenant was now a king. No one would believe that there were so many big shots in a small county. The 3 of them sat in the courtyard. Li Yi ordered the kitchen to prepare a few dishes and a pot of wine. Lu Dao couldn't let go of him because of his identity. Sung Shichen ignored him because he didn't see Zure Mo. After a few glasses of wine, they all started to talk. "Your Highness." Lu Dao picked up a mouthful of food and said, "Back in Qing'an Prefecture, I knew that Your Highness was not an ordinary person. The small Anxi County couldn't trap you. The luckiest thing that happened to me in my life was to be the magistrate of Anxi County." He chuckled. "That's what I thought too. After being the capital governor and the Minister of Justice for so long, I actually missed the days back in Anxi County." Lu Dao didn't have a high tolerance for alcohol. Even though it wasn't hard liquor, he was soon drunk. He leaned on the table and muttered to himself. Sung Shichen drank unhurriedly. After Lu Dao was drunk, he took another sip of wine and said slowly, "Back then, Big Brother was framed. In order to protect the Zheng family, he took all the blame. His family was destroyed. At that time, my official rank was too low, and I could only watch. Later, I climbed to the position of Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Revenue and repeated what that person had done to Big Brother. Later, I let him die on the road of exile. Revenge was taken, but the Zheng family was no longer the Zheng family. Later, when Zemo came to the capital, she didn't want to acknowledge me as her second uncle. She liked me so much when she was young." Sung Shichen took a big gulp of wine and smiled. "I still have to thank you for this, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." He picked up the wine pot and drank to his heart's content. Then he stood up and patted his shoulder. "Don't let Zemo be wronged, I beg of you." Sung Shichen walked away reeking of wine. Li knew that he wasn't drunk. In this world, there were always some people with special plots. Princesses and empresses were considered normal. There were also sister Khan, daughter Khan, and niece Khan. Some of these people had dirty thoughts, and some were pure. They really protected and loved each other from the bottom of their hearts. Changde walked out of the backyard. His breathing was a little chaotic. This wasn't common for a grandmaster like him, unless another grandmaster forced his breathing to be chaotic. Emingzu, on the other hand, appeared calm and composed. A chrysanthemum-like smile bloomed on Changde's old face. He bowed and said, "This old servant is no longer a match for Your Highness." Li felt a little sad. Even Emingzu had broken through. When would his opportunity to become a grandmaster come? On second thought, even if he broke through, he wouldn't be able to defeat Chang, Su, or even Emingzu and Rui. What was the point of such a breakthrough? Li Duan held Xiao Rui's hand and ran out from the backyard. The 2 of them had been separated for several years, but these days, they were inseparable. When he ran past Lao Chang, he halted, bowed and said, "Master." Xiao Rui also looked at Emingzu. "Auntie." She didn't know who Changde was, so she didn't know how to greet him. She just called him master like Li Duan. Li Duan looked at Emingzu and hesitated for a moment before saying, "Auntie." Before Li Yi could correct him, He ran outside with Xiao Rui. The Zhao kingdom has sent an ambassador. Emingzu sat beside him and said, in the past few months, Zhao Yi personally led the army and broke through the cities of the Zhao kingdom with irresistible force. Now, half of the Zhao kingdom has fallen into the hands of the Qi kingdom. Li Yi thought about it and asked, the Zhao kingdom wants to borrow troops? Emingzi nodded and said, what the courtiers mean is that although we have old grudges with the Zhao kingdom, if the Qi kingdom conquers the Zhao kingdom, it will become a greater threat to us. In order to prevent the Qi kingdom from growing stronger, we should send troops. Li Yi shook his head and said, I'm afraid it's too late. Sending troops was not something that could be done on a whim. Not only did they have to mobilize the troops, they also had to prepare rations and pay for the troops. In addition to the long journey, by the time the troops guarding the borders received these orders, it would already be too late. This time, it could be said that Zhao Yi had made up his mind to go crazy. He was the kind of person who would kill anything that stood in his way. His expansion would eventually become a serious problem for the Wu kingdom and the Jing kingdom. Neither kingdom would sit by and do nothing. It was because he knew this that he sent troops so quickly and wanted to conquer the Zhao kingdom in the shortest time possible. When the Zhao kingdom was completely conquered by the Qi kingdom, it would not be easy to touch them. Emingzi nodded and said, even if it's too late, we have to be prepared. Once the Qi kingdom grows stronger, they will eventually point their spear at us. Li Yi shook his head and said, Zhao Yi is a smart man. Without heaven's punishment and cannons, he will not send troops to the Jing kingdom or the Wu kingdom. The emergence of gunpowder and cannons had made the Jing kingdom and the Wu kingdom look like they had turned on a cheat code. In terms of military strength, they had rapidly advanced to the forefront of the world. Coupled with suitable tactics, they were almost invincible. Zhao Yi knew this very well. Without heaven's punishment, he would not dare to do so. The two of them were discussing this matter in the courtyard. Outside the courtyard, Li Duan and little Rui were sitting on the swing. Suddenly, he turned his head to look at her and asked, little Rui, will you marry me in the future? Of course. The little girl turned to look at him and said matter-of-factly, we've agreed. Are you going back on your word? No. Li Duan hurriedly shook his head and said, however, if you marry me in the future, you can't call that aunt anymore. Why not? The little girl blinked and looked at him curiously. What else can I call you if not aunt? Call me mother. Li Duan thought for a moment and said, also the little auntie who gave you the candy just now, you can't call her little auntie. You have to call her Lil Miss like me. The affairs of the Zhao kingdom were attended by countless important officials in the imperial court. A few days before the new year, Li Yi went out to visit a few old generals and gave them the gifts he had received a few days ago. Then came the new year. On the third day of the first lunar month in the 5th year of Jingping, something big happened in the capital city. Even for the entire Jing kingdom, this was a major event. On this day, the empress gave birth to a baby boy. Both mother and child were safe. Chapter 1165. Li Xian was so happy that he went crazy. Seeing him stand up and sit down and stand up again with an uncontrollable excitement on his face, Li Yi suddenly felt a little distress for Li Xian's son, who didn't even have a name until now. His name was the Emperor. Empress Wang Qin gave birth to 2 princesses, and imperial concubine Shen Su gave birth to a princess. Li Xian's hair was about to turn white from worry. If Xiao Rui was a prince, Li Yi felt that Li Xian had already titled himself as the emperor. The next day, Li Xian announced the news that the empress's legitimate son would be the crown prince. If it wasn't for the fact that his youngest son couldn't even crawl, then the imperial edict would be the succession edict. The one who was obviously relieved was Li Han. Li Yi clearly felt that he walked a lot more briskly. Li Han was 17 years old this year, which was definitely considered young. Young people were prone to make mistakes and didn't think about things comprehensively. Most of the time, they could only see the surface. Li Xian's crown prince didn't even have teeth. Even if he was educated according to the standard of an emperor, it would take at least 10 or 20 years for him to be able to take charge. Li Xian couldn't wait for 10 or 20 years. Therefore, before Wang Qin gave birth to the crown prince, Li Xian still had a bit of face. He would take into account all aspects and not pass the throne to Li Han. Now he would not pass the throne to Li Han, but His Royal Highness Prince Jin couldn't run away, because the crown prince was still young. When the emperor experienced the suffering of the people, he needed someone to assist him. Looking at Li Han talking to Duanwu with a smile on his face, Li Yi couldn't bear to break his dream, so he let him sleep a little longer for the time being. This year's court meeting was not on the first day of the first lunar month. Those days were the empress's due date. In the royal family, this was a first-class event, so the date of the court meeting naturally had to be postponed. Now it was a double happiness. Li Yi originally did not want to participate in the Grand Court Assembly, but he wanted to see what Emingzu looked like wearing a phoenix crown and a phoenix cloak. She would only wear those clothes when she was in court. Shanning, who was in charge of the Women's Union and many colleges in the capital, would also appear at the Imperial Court Conference. The Qi Kingdom, the Wu Kingdom, and the Zhao Kingdom had all sent envoys to the Jing Kingdom. This time, they didn't just send envoys casually. Instead, they sent envoys to the Jing Kingdom with formal etiquette. This was probably the pinnacle of diplomatic relations in the history of the Jing Kingdom. Your Highness Jiang of Silla. Greetings, Your Highness Jiang of Silla. During the distance from the palace gate to the political hall, all the officials that Li Yi met, some of whom he knew, some of whom he did not, bowed to him. Old General Xue sighed and said, I still remember the first time you stood here a few years ago. Back then you were just a young boy. In just a few years, you are already standing in front of us, the old fellows who have been in the court for decades. The few old generals usually did not attend court, but they would not miss the annual Grand Court Assembly. Old General Ma stroked his beard, and a look of reminiscence appeared on his face. The few of us only noticed you because of Tianfa. Who would have thought that you were hiding so much more than just Tianfa? Compared to you, we are really old. Li Yi smiled and said, since ancient times, the waves behind beat the waves in front, and the waves in front die on the beach. This is normal. Old General Xue suddenly looked at him and shook his head. He said, you have changed a lot over the years, but your shamelessness has always been on par with old man Ma. Surnamed Xue, in terms of shamelessness, I am still 10 feet away from you. Li Yi smiled as he watched the two of them start their daily bickering. Then he turned around to take a look. He was sitting at the front of the court. Li Xian had sent someone to bring a chair over, but he had rejected it. From his position, there were more than 100 civil and military officials in the hall. They stood orderly, and their faces were full of smiles, mixed with a trace of pride and arrogance. Behind them, there were still countless figures outside the hall. No matter how big the legislative hall was, it could not accommodate all the officials who had come to the capital to attend the Grand Court Assembly. This was the Jing Kingdom. The Jing Kingdom that he did not have any sense of belonging to in the beginning. Now, step by step, he had completely integrated into the Jing Kingdom. At a certain moment, the hundreds of officials suddenly bowed at the same time and said loudly, Welcome, Your Majesty, welcome Princess Royal. After Li Xian sat down, he raised both of his hands and said calmly, Everyone please rise. After that, it was time for the Grand Court Assembly to go through the proper procedures. Since ancient times, emperors have established themselves in order to rule over the world. They must establish a dynasty and establish the foundation of the country, so that the ancestral clan and society can rest without borders. I, the emperor, have been trembling all night and look up to my ancestor, Mo Lai. My legitimate son Li Zhe is a hero, and belongs to the will of the heavens. I hereby abide by the first imperial edict, record the ceremony, bow down to the will of the people, and sincerely inform the heavens and the earth, the ancestral temple, and the country that I hereby confer the title of Crown Prince and appoint him as the Eastern Palace's Crown Prince. This was the first imperial edict announced by the eunuchs in the Grand Court Assembly. Li Xian's intention to shift the blame to others had been going on for several years. This little fellow, Li Zhe, became the Crown Prince on the first day of his birth, and became the future master of the Jing Kingdom. He had only been in this world for less than 24 hours, but Li Xian had already praised him to the heavens. Words like talent and outstanding were endless. The hundreds of officials could do nothing about it, and there were countless people who looked bitter. How could they, as the officials, not know what His Majesty was thinking? However, it was not easy for the Empress to give birth to a legitimate son, so no one would raise any objection at this time. The Second Imperial Edict was to expand the number of members of the State Affair Council. The original number of members of the State Affair Council was increased from 15 to 20. The State Affair Council was an institution proposed by the eldest princess several years ago. The members of this institution were composed of 2 prime ministers, 6 ministers, the imperial censor, the governor of the capital, and several important officials. Among them, the name of Prince Jean Li Han was also included. No one was allowed to monopolize the power when there was a difficult decision to be made. The members of the State Affair Council had to discuss and make a decision together, and then report it to His Majesty or the eldest princess. His Majesty had no objection to this proposal. In recent years, the decision of the State Affair Council had been passed by His Majesty and the eldest princess. To some extent, the existence of the State Affair Council allowed His Majesty to be lazy with a clear conscience. This made the hundreds of officials doubt His Majesty's intentions more than once. However, this was indeed beneficial to the country, so no one could raise any objection to it. Every member of the State Affair Council could be a prime minister. From then on, all the officials in the imperial court and even the literati of the Jing Kingdom aimed to enter the State Affair Council. The imperial edict to appoint the crown prince and increase the number of members of the State Affair Council were the 2 most important matters. What followed was a long and tedious report from an official that everyone loved to listen to. Within these 4 hours, they would know the changes in the military, economy, politics, population, and system of the Jing Kingdom in the past year. The Jing Kingdom had been making progress every year. They had God's punishment and cannons, which could intimidate all the other countries. The national treasury was filled day by day, and various new policies that were beneficial to the people were introduced continuously. This was the result of the hard work of all the people present here for a year. These results would be written on the imperial board and posted on the walls of the palace, which was transparent to the people of the Jing Kingdom. Li Yu was actually not very interested in these things. He looked at Emingzu, who was sitting above him, and thought to himself, I must remind her to take this dress with her when I leave in a few days. Chapter 1166. 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, none of the officials in the hall would have imagined that one day they would be able to witness such a grand court conference. Politics, economy, population, agriculture, commerce. Almost every aspect that they could think of was developing at a gratifying speed. In the past, they could not see the future of the Jing Kingdom because they were confused. Now, they still could not see the future of the Jing Kingdom, because the Jing Kingdom's development had far exceeded their imagination. Of course, the Grand Court Conference brought not only joy but also worry to the officials. Especially after Chen Chong, the provincial governor of Shuzhou, presented the memorial. Almost half of the people in the court changed their expressions. They were suspicious, shocked, incredulous, and deeply regretful. This was the first time Chen Chong, the provincial governor of Shuzhou, attended a grand court conference. Regardless of whether it was the old officials who had been in the court for decades, or the new officials in the court in recent years, the name Chen Chong was no stranger to them. In the past, the Duke of Chen's household had been so illustrious. Although it could not cover the sky with one hand, in the capital, a brick thrown on the street could hit a marquee. The Chen clan was already one of the top clans. The Chen family used to be glorious. Later, because they were involved in the Cui family's rebellion, they declined overnight. Later, they completely disappeared from the capital. Some people knew that he had become the provincial governor of Shuzhou in the fief of the Jiang of Silla, but some people had completely forgotten about him. Today, this man, who was once a prominent figure in the capital, once again walked in front of the people. He brought a few pieces of news. In the past 5 years, the population of Shuzhou had officially surpassed the capital and became the most populous city in the Jing Kingdom. The tax revenue of Shuzhou last year was 20% of the tax revenue of the entire Jing Kingdom. This did not exceed the tax revenue, which saved them some face. But that was only Shuzhou. The tax revenue of Shuzhou was 20% of the tax revenue of the Jing Kingdom. This meant that Shuzhou alone was equivalent to more than 10 provinces in the Jing Kingdom. But this had nothing to do with them, because as early as 5 years ago, the court officials unanimously discussed and almost couldn't wait to give all the tax collection rights of Shu province for the next 50 years to Jiang of Silla. They even gave the entire Shu province to Jiang of Silla. At that time, they were still wondering if they should give 2 more. At the time, they had thought that as long as he could leave the capital, anything would be fine. 5 years ago, a prefecture in the Jing Kingdom was worth more than 10 Shu prefectures. 5 years later, Shu Prefecture was worth more than 10 ordinary prefectures in the Jing Kingdom. It was more than 100 times more. It had only been 5 years. No one knew what would happen in Shuzhou in 50 years. All the officials in the hall were filled with regret. They couldn't help but turn their heads to look at the figure standing at the very front. They didn't know whether to feel fear or respect. Li Yi had been watching the progress of the Imperial Court Conference. After the officials of the various prefectures in the Jing Kingdom finished their reports, it was time for the envoys from other countries to meet the emperor. Several years ago, the Jing Kingdom was weak. The envoys of Qi and Zhao acted like they were in their own garden in the Golden Palace of the Jing Kingdom. Their words and actions were quite inappropriate. But now the situation was completely different. After presenting the generous gifts, the envoys of the small countries showed their subservience. The envoys of the Wu Kingdom didn't send any gifts. Her Majesty just sent someone to deliver a letter of credence. In the first month of the 5th year of Jinghe, the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom officially established diplomatic relations. From then on, they would be friendly neighbors, non-aggression, trade barriers would be removed, and trade with each other. The gifts sent by the envoys of the Zhao Kingdom were very generous, because they came to ask for help. The army of the Qi Kingdom was approaching the imperial city of the Zhao Kingdom. If the Jing Kingdom didn't lend a helping hand, it wouldn't take long for the Zhao Kingdom to disappear in the long river of history. Although the envoys of the Qi Kingdom were not as enthusiastic as those of the Wu Kingdom, they also expressed their intention to establish diplomatic relations. When they presented themselves, the envoys of the Zhao Kingdom kept a straight face from the beginning to the end. The Imperial Court Conference started in the morning and lasted for several hours. It didn't end until the afternoon. A few of the old generals and some of the senior officials in the court had already been given a seat by Li Xian before the court session had even begun. The younger officials, on the other hand, had been standing the entire time. When the court session ended, almost all of them were limping. It was just a few hours. Li Yi didn't feel anything. After the Imperial Court Conference was over, he was the first to leave. He didn't walk far when he heard a hurried voice behind him. "Your Highness Jiang of Silla, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." The voice was very familiar. Li Yi turned around and saw Wei Liang jogging toward him. Wei Liang came with the envoy of the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi saw him just now. It was just that it wasn't convenient to talk to him in that situation. Li Yi and Wei Liang hadn't seen each other for a long time. He smiled and asked, "How is your empress?" Wei Liang smiled and said, "Her Majesty has just ascended the throne. Everything is fine. It's just that she's a little busy with the affairs of the state every day. To wear the crown, one must bear its weight. Emingzu was like that. Yang Liuqing was also like that." The Wu Kingdom had just settled down. There were many things waiting to be done. Of course, she would be very busy. There were many things that she had never touched before. However, he had Old Man Wang and the others to watch him. He wouldn't make any big mistakes. "Brotherly, long time no see." Another voice came from his side. Li Yi turned his head and saw Yang Yanzhou, who had just walked out of the hall. He was here on behalf of Zhao Yi. His purpose was naturally to stop the Jing Kingdom from helping the Zhao Kingdom. However, the Imperial Court of the Jing Kingdom had already made a decision on this. Although the Jing Kingdom and the Zhao Kingdom had old grudges, the Qi Kingdom was ambitious. They would never let the Qi Kingdom become stronger. Half a month ago, the order to stop the Qi Kingdom and help the Zhao Kingdom had been sent out urgently. By now, the Jing Kingdom's army at the border of Qi and Zhao must have taken action. Li Yi shook his head and said, "What are you doing here instead of staying by Zhao Yi's side?" Zhao Yi must know that no matter who he sends, it will be useless. Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, I have to try to know whether it will be useful or not. Now that you have tried, is it useful? Yang Yanzhou shook his head with a bitter smile. Li Yi was too lazy to talk about these things. He waved his hand casually and said, Before I came out, there was still soup in the pot. If you don't want to talk about national affairs, you can come to the mansion of Jiang of Silla when you have time. Of course. Wei Liang waved his hand. Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, In that case, I will pay a visit to Brotherly tomorrow. The officials who came out of the hall were surprised to see His Highness Jiang of Silla and the envoys of Qi and Wu talking cheerfully and wittily. It was obvious that this was not the first time they had met each other. They naturally did not think that Jiang of Silla had committed treason. However, even the envoys of the Qi kingdom and the Wu kingdom seemed to be on good terms with him. Whether he was in the capital or not, Jiang of Silla was still the same Jiang of Silla. An official looked at the back of Jiang of Silla disappearing. He quickly took a few steps forward and said to the slowly walking Prime Minister Shin, Prime Minister Shin, Shu Province cannot be handed over to Jiang of Silla like this. Chapter 1167. The Shu province of today was no longer the Shu province of the past. The Shu province of today was practically the largest treasury of the Jing kingdom. In just 5 years, it had surpassed the capital in terms of population and economy. Who knew what it would be like in 50 years? A country within a country? This was something that he absolutely did not want to see. This was also something that all the officials in the court did not want to see. Even though they had unanimously decided to give Shu province to the Jiang of Silla a few years ago, what was credibility? What a country needed was always profit. The official walked up to Shen Xiang and said hurriedly, Just now in the hall, you must have heard what Provincial Governor Qin Chong said. The Shu province is so rich now. The court must take it back. Shen Xiang, who had been walking slowly, stopped in his tracks. His eyes turned cloudy. He looked at the official and asked, What did Minister Wei just say? The middle-aged official looked at him and repeated, We must take back Shu province from the hands of the Jiang of Silla. Shen Xiang asked doubtfully, The Jiang of Silla? What's wrong with the Jiang of Silla? The middle-aged official moved closer to him and raised his voice. The Jing kingdom's Shu province cannot fall into the hands of the Jiang of Silla again. Shen Xiang asked in surprise, Shu province? What's wrong with Shu province? The middle-aged official was speechless. Shen Xiang pointed at his ears and smiled. I'm getting old. My ears don't work so well anymore. Minister Wei, please don't blame me. I was thinking a few days ago that these old bones of mine really couldn't hold on any longer. I was planning to resign from His Majesty in a few months. The middle-aged official was shocked. He immediately said, Prime Minister Shen is the pillar of the court. You are a role model for us officials. If you leave, who else can suppress the treacherous officials in the court? Shen Xiang sighed and looked at the middle-aged official. He said, For a country, although benefits are the most important, we can't just care about the benefits in front of us. We have to live up to our own conscience and the conscience of the world. The official opened his mouth. Prime Minister Shen, without the treacherous officials you speak of, there wouldn't be today's Jing kingdom, and there wouldn't be today's Minister of Wei. Shen Xiang looked at him. His back was no longer bent, and his eyes were no longer turbid. He spoke again. His Majesty hasn't said anything. Minister Wei, you don't have to worry about these things. Before Prime Minister Shen left, he looked at him again and said, Today, the people standing in the court already owe him too much. We can't owe any more. If we owe any more, I'm afraid we will suffer retribution. After Shen Xiang left, the middle-aged official stood there in a daze. He only felt that his throat was a little dry. He licked his dry lips. Shen Xiang's words were very clear. If he insisted on targeting Jiang of Silla, Shen Xiang would not help him. At that moment, he finally realized that Jiang of Silla was much more terrifying than he had imagined. However, he was only thinking about the Jing kingdom. What did he do wrong? Confusion and hesitation appeared on his face. He slowly took a step forward and disappeared in the direction of the palace gate alone. When Li Yi came out, the pot was really stewing soup. The soup had been stewing for a few hours, and the taste was very rich. Ever since he realized that he had underestimated Emingzu, he picked up the skills that he had put aside for many years. She only had a low starting point, but there was a lot of room for her to grow, far beyond Li Yi's imagination. Shanning ran over and said pitifully, "I also want to drink Royal Sister's soup, but she won't give it to me." Li Yi patted her head and said, "Your Royal Sister has to deal with so many affairs of the country every day. She needs to nourish her body. I'll make your favorite soup later." The soup that Emingzi drank naturally couldn't be given to Shanning. It wasn't because she didn't need it, but she was only 18 years old. At the very least, it would take a few more years for Li Yi's beastly and guilty feelings to dispel. After finishing the soup for the two of them, he still had to do other things. This time, when he left the capital city, he would come back to accompany Emingzi and Shanning. He wouldn't make such a big fuss. Therefore, the Jiang of Silla residence, which had always only accepted gifts but not given gifts, was finally generous for a while. Today, Li Yi held a banquet in the residence. It wasn't a big banquet, but he sent invitations to all who he thought needed to say goodbye. The first person to visit was Lu Yi. He had just finished patrolling the Beijing-Hebei region. After entering the small courtyard, he quickly walked up to him with a slightly excited face. "Your Excellency, you're back." When he was still a county lieutenant, Lu Yi called him Your Excellency. This form of address had almost never changed over the years. Li Yi habitually patted him on the shoulder and said with a smile, "You're already a minister. Show some of the minister's manner and aura." The minister of the Ministry of Justice, who had always been impartial and upright, showed an embarrassed expression at this moment. Lu Dayo and Sung Shichen visited him at the same time. Both of them came from the Anxi County government, so they naturally contacted each other frequently in the past few years. For some reason, Sung Shichen also hooked up with the two of them. Two ministers and a governor of the capital city had already occupied 3 seats in the State Affairs Council. As soon as Lu Dayo and Sung Shichen sat down, Li Yi heard a rough voice. "Ha ha ha, little Li, I've known you for so many years, but this is the first time I've taken advantage of you. Today, take out all the good wine in your residence. I want to drink to my heart's content." "Little brat, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You must treat me with good wine and good dishes." It was rare for old General Shui and old General Ma to be united. There was no question of who was bigger or smaller, or who could urinate higher or further. It seemed that they were ready to make a killing on Li Yi. Li Yi smiled and said, "Rest assured, old generals. Today, I will personally cook and treat you well." Li Han had originally planned to sneak out with Duan Wu, but Li Yi conveniently grabbed him as a helper. In the entire capital, Li Yi really could not find a more qualified roaster than him. The fish caught from the lake of the Mathematics Institute were still fresh, and there was no shortage of sauce. All that was left was Li Han. Dong Wenyun came together with the Shen family and the Wang family. Dong Wenyun was the son-in-law of the Shen family. The Shen family could be considered as one family with 2 prime ministers and an imperial concubine in the palace. However, the Wang family's empress gave birth to the crown prince. It was hard to say who would be the final winner. However, at least on the surface, they seemed to be in harmony. There were also some relatives of the Li family, but there were only a few of them. Wei Liang and Yang Yanzhou also chose to freeload today. Li Yi reckoned that he had to find a few helpers. Otherwise, he would not be able to handle so many people at once. Today, the Jiang of Silla residence, from the inside to the outside, from the master to the servants, everyone was exceptionally busy. Wei Xian stood at the entrance of the Jiang of Silla residence and hesitated for a long time. He did not know whether he should step in or not. After he returned, he thoroughly investigated the information about the Jiang of Silla. The results of the investigation made him unable to sleep for the entire night. His poetry was unparalleled. Even an uneducated child could recite a few sentences. Every word of his could be sold at a sky-high price. He had never seen anyone whose calligraphy was sold at a price of a word. He had reached the peak of what a scholar could achieve. He improved the art of interrogation by torture and reduced the number of cruel officials in the Jing kingdom. He offered the horseshoes and created the Heavenly Punishment Society. The army of the Jing kingdom was invincible and invincible. With his own strength, he repelled the diplomatic mission of the Qi kingdom and preserved the dignity of the Jing kingdom. He established the school of mathematics and started a new school of mathematics. He eliminated a large number of vermin in the court. The politics, economy, military, commerce, agriculture of the Jing kingdom. As long as Wei Xian could think of it, the shadow of Jiang of Silla could be seen. Because of this, he was trusted by the emperors of 2 dynasties. He became the youngest minister of the imperial court in history, and the only foreign official in the history of the Jing kingdom to be conferred the title of prince. He had also reached the peak of what an official could achieve. Such a person should be valued by the emperors. However, due to various reasons, he left the capital city for 5 years. Wei Xian admired the Jiang of Silla very much. He even prostrated himself before him. Wei Xian admitted that the officials had wronged him. However, Shuzhou was the Jing kingdom's Shuzhou, not the Jiang of Silla's Shuzhou. He handed the name card to the concierge and said, "Please report that I, Wei Xian, request to meet the Jiang of Silla." Chapter 1168. The gatekeeper of the Jiang of Silla residence was especially busy today. Usually, only one person was needed to guard the door, but today there were 5 people on duty. Those who came to the residence today were either high-ranking officials or dignitaries. His Highness could afford to neglect them, but the gatekeeper could not. Hearing that the visitor reported his official title as minister in charge, one of the gatekeepers immediately became alert. He accepted the name card and stepped forward. "Sir, please come in." Today, some people who came to the Jiang of Silla residence would hand over their name cards and invitations according to the rules, but some people swaggered in, such as the old generals just now. They did not need to check the invitations one by one. In the entire capital, no one dared to freeload or cause trouble during the banquet of the Jiang of Silla residence. The gatekeeper led him through more than half of the residence, pointed to a courtyard in front and said, "This lowly one will escort you here, sir, can go in by yourself." Wei Xian took a deep breath and stepped in. Then he saw such a scene. Old General Ma pointed at Old General Shue's nose and scolded, "You old thing, there are only 2 drumsticks in total, and you actually want to monopolize them." Old General Shue had a drumstick in his mouth, but he was not to be outdone and scolded back. "Old thing, you still have the nerve to scold me? Just now that jar of 30-years-old wine was completely drunk by you. Did I say anything?" Old General Shue and Old General Ma were pointing at the sky and scolding each other. Right Prime Minister Dong Wenyun and Minister of Revenue Tseng Shichen clinked their glasses. The person lying under the table and being carried into the room was the capital governor Lu Dayo. Minister of Justice Lu Yishui was serving dishes to the old generals. The 2 people in the innermost area should be the envoys of the Wu Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. If he was not mistaken, the one squatting there grilling fish and crying because of the smoke was the Dean of the Divinity Academy, Prince Jin Li Han. From his angle, he could see the kitchen. The figure bustling about in the kitchen was none other than Jiang of Silla. Beside him were Princess Shaning and Princess Royal. Wei Xian did a rough count. More than half of the 20 members of the State Council were here. 1 prime minister, 2 ambassadors, 3 ministers, and 4 old generals. In this small courtyard, more than half of the core forces in the imperial court of the Jing kingdom had gathered. "Hey, Lord Wei is here too. Why are you so late? Come sit here." Dong Wenyun's voice came from beside him. Wei Xian turned his head and was pulled to the table in a daze. He opened his mouth. "Prime Minister Dong." Dong Wenyun smiled and said, "There's no Prime Minister Dong here, and we're not talking about national affairs today. Let's drink, let's drink." After saying that, the wine glass in front of Wei Xian was filled to the brim. Li Yi was busy in the kitchen alone. He was cursing these bastards in his heart. They were indeed unreliable. His Emingzu and Shaning were still the most considerate. When the last dish was out of the pot, he washed his hands and walked out of the kitchen. Li Xian's figure came in time from outside the courtyard. Not only him, but his empress and imperial concubine were also there. Li Xian had always been good at timing. It was neither early nor late. He used to freeload alone, but now his whole family came together. Since his daughter had been freeloaded by his family, he would let him freeload again this time. Your Majesty, Your Majesty, Your Majesty, and Imperial Concubine. At several banquets in the courtyard, even those who were drunk instantly sobered up and immediately stood up to salute. Li Xian waved his hand and said, "You don't have to be so polite today. You can eat your own." Although he said so, it didn't matter whether he came or not. Now no one dared to be presumptuous. Even the two old generals' quarreling voices were much lower. Li Xian and his empress and imperial concubine naturally had to sit in the room. Emingzu and Shaning were at the same table with them. Li Han, who had just gotten rid of his mission of grilling fish, could only sigh and squat back to grill another fish. "You invited guests, but you didn't call me." Li Xian was quite dissatisfied with this. Li Yi would rather brag to the two old generals than let Li Xian come and spoil everyone's mood. He had a feeling that the number of times he would be spoiled by Li Xian in the future would increase. Li Xian picked up a mouthful of food and looked at Li Yi. He asked, "When are you leaving?" "After the 15th. Li Yi thought for a moment. He didn't want to stay in the capital for too long. Li Xian sighed and said, "I don't think I'll leave so soon. I'll at least wait until Zhe is 1 year old." Li Yi looked at him warily and asked, "Where are you going?" "Suzhou," Li Xian said matter-of-factly. "I plan to move the Academy of Sciences there when the time comes. Build me another base in Rui City." Up until now, Li Yi still hadn't figured out why Li Xian was able to say such shameless things so easily. Did he kidnap his daughter or sister? Even if he did kidnap his daughter or sister, wasn't his request too much? Li Yi looked at him and asked, "You don't want to be the emperor anymore?" Li Xian glanced at him and said, "Don't you have the crown prince?" Li Yi looked behind him. Li Xian's crown prince was lying on the bed asleep with 4 palace maids watching over him. "Your crown prince can decide the affairs of the country for you? Don't you have the State Affairs Council? What if the State Affairs Council can't decide?" "Brother, sir, the fish is here." Li Han brought the grilled fish over. Li Yi looked at Li Han and didn't say anything. Li Xian picked up a piece of fish and looked at Li Yi. He suddenly said, "I plan to make Duanwu a princess. What do you think?" Hearing Duanwu's name, Li Han immediately pricked up his ears. Li Yi shook his head. "I don't have any objections. Duanwu and Xiaohan are a perfect match. However, she has the status of a princess. If she marries Xiaohan, others won't gossip about her." Li Xian looked at Li Han and asked, "Xiaohan, you're going to be 18 soon. Brother plans to betroth Duanwu to you. It's time for you to fulfill your marriage with the Wang family. Why don't we do it together?" Li Han was overjoyed, but his face was serious. "It's all up to you, brother." Li Xian nodded his head and said, "Brother has to go out for a while. Zhe is too young to be the crown prince. As his uncle, you should help him. Brother plans to let you be the regent for the time being. What do you think?" Li Han picked up a piece of fish and almost dropped it on the ground. It turned out to be a multiple-choice question. A. Marry Duanwu and Ling. B. Regent. This was not a single-choice question. Either A and B choose at the same time, or neither. Li Han took a deep breath and sighed. "It's all up to you, brother." The officials in the courtyard didn't know that their emperor used a meal to change the structure of the Jing kingdom for the next few years, or even more than 10 years. There are gains and losses. The current Prince Jin, the future Prince Regent, will regard this truth as the true meaning of life for a long time. The banquet ended earlier than Li Yi expected. Because of Li Xian, the officials present all took their leave after eating and drinking their fill. Li Yi stood in the courtyard side and said, "Why do you think the late emperor passed the throne to you?" Li Xian looked depressed. "I don't want to." A figure crawled out from under the table. He patted the dust on his body and bowed. "This official greets your majesty and Jiang of Silla." Li Yi looked at him. "This is Wei Xian, Minister of Revenue." Li Xian looked at him and said in surprise, "You don't know the guest you invited?" Li Yi didn't know this Minister of Revenue. It was reasonable to say that a dignified Minister of Revenue shouldn't be here for a meal. Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Minister Wei, what's the matter?" Today Wei Xian ate the chicken cooked by Jiang of Silla, and the fish roasted by Prince Jin. He also saw the many ministers and pillars of the court, standing in this small courtyard, and standing in the main hall was a completely different side. He also heard the conversation between His Majesty and Jiang of Silla. This official admires His Highness Jiang of Silla very much. He took a step back and bowed to Li Yi. I heard that His Highness is leaving. This official came uninvited to see His Highness off. I hope His Highness doesn't mind. Chapter 1169. Since the day the Crown Prince was born, the capital city had been immersed in jubilation. This kind of jubilation would probably last until the Lantern Festival. In the days before the Lantern Festival, the court was usually not in session, but this year, there were many government decrees. The first was naturally the crowning of the Crown Prince, which was a major event related to the livelihood of the people. Then the court announced to the public that they would help the Zhao Kingdom, helping the Zhao Kingdom to resist the Qi Kingdom. The formal establishment of diplomatic relations with the Wu Kingdom. From then on, the two countries would be equal and mutually beneficial, which could be regarded as the third major event. Zhao Yi's plan failed, and Yang Yanzhou was about to return in vain. This time, I'm afraid I can't see you off, Brother Li. Yang Yanzhou would leave in 3 days, and Li Yi would stay a few days longer than him. Li Yi looked at him and shook his head, saying, Isn't it good to stay obediently in your Qi Kingdom? Why do you have to go through so much trouble? Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, His Majesty often said that a person's life is only a short few decades. Once it's over, you can't go back. Since that's the case, you might as well be bold, see the people you want to see, do the things you want to do, and live in this world not in vain. Why didn't Li Yi realize before that Zhao Yi had the potential to be a philosopher, and a chicken soup philosopher? However, that was his business. A queen lover was not qualified to laugh at an emperor lover. Zhao Yi was free to do whatever he wanted. He nodded and said, Then I wish him good luck. Yang Yanzhou nodded and said, Since His Majesty ascended to the throne, he has been working day and night and has been sick. He has caught a cold for several months and hasn't recovered. I hope Brother Li's auspicious words. Wei Liang left the second day after Yang Yanzhou's departure. Both the Wu Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom had just stabilized their regimes, but the two countries were walking in completely different directions. Zhao Yi wanted to strengthen the country through external expeditions, while Yang Liuqing wanted to take the path of stability and peace. This was also the plan that Li Yi had formulated for her from the beginning. By the time we left, the citizens of the country were almost completely loyal to His Majesty. When His Majesty entered the capital, some of the large clans in the capital provided great assistance. If not for that, we would not have been able to take down the capital so quickly. Wei Liang said. Then he shook his head and said, However, after His Majesty ascended to the throne, those large clans united and formed many constraints on His Highness. The Wu Kingdom was different from the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. During the uprising in Yangliuqing, he made use of the contradictions between the landlords and the peasants, and between the aristocratic families and the country gentry. Basically speaking, the interests of the aristocratic families were at stake. Under this historical background, it was impossible for those large clans that occupied a large amount of resources to be completely wiped out. There needed to be a balance between them, and this balance was not so easy to achieve. A few days ago, Li Yi had already received the news that Rui had gone to the Wu Kingdom. After the matter in the capital was settled, they would first return to Rui City, and stay for a few days before going to the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi nodded and said, In a few days, I will go to the capital to take a look. A look of joy appeared on Wei Liang's face as he said, That couldn't be better. After Wei Liang left, Li Yi also walked out of the small courtyard. Voices came from the roof. Xiao Rui, I'm leaving soon. You have to miss me. Father said that when my brother grows up a little, I will be able to go and find you. How old will you be when you grow up a little? Oh my, very soon. In a month? At the very least, I'll have to wait for a year. Ah, that's a long time. It's a little long, but by then we will have already grown up. Why don't you marry me? Then we won't have to be separated. Okay. What if Uncle Li doesn't agree? Then we will elope. Li Yi did not know that the eldest young master of the Li family had already planned to elope with the eldest princess. He left the prince's mansion and went to the imperial palace. He and Emingzu stood in front of a palace. This was an independent palace, surrounded by a high outer wall, forming an enclosed courtyard. In fact, there were not many people living in the imperial palace. Li Xian and the others lived in Hibiscus Garden, so did the Empress Dowager and old princess. The other concubines of the former emperor were also arranged by Li Xian to live in other courtyards. The imperial palace had become a cage. And this palace was a cage within a cage. Naturally, there would be prisoners in the cage. "Let me out, you traitors, traitors! Save me, where are the imperial guards? Come and save me. Open the door for me, I want to go to the imperial court. The imperial court cannot do without me. The Jing kingdom cannot do without me." This was a voice that Li Yi had almost forgotten. When the king of Shu was captured, he pretended to be crazy. Li Xian kept him here, so he did not have to worry about food and drink. Every once in a while, he would send some books in to relieve his boredom, but he was not allowed to step out of the palace. This palace door, except for a small hole at the bottom for delivering food and other things, had not been opened for a long time. Li Emingzu looked at a eunuch in front and said, "Open the door." "Yes." The eunuch took out a key from his pocket, inserted it into the keyhole, and opened the lock. Li Yi walked forward, put one hand on the door, and pushed it open. Creak! Soon a heavy, almost decaying sound was heard. A man sat in the front courtyard. His clothes were messy, his hair was unkempt, and his face was dirty. He looked like a beggar. He looked at the open door in a daze, and an ecstatic expression appeared on his face. He said happily, "Is someone here to save me? When I get out, I will make you the prime minister." He quickly got up from the ground and ran outside. Halfway through, he saw a figure in front of the door. He suddenly stopped in his tracks, and an expression of extreme horror appeared on his face. It was as if he had seen a man-eating demon. He ran back at a faster speed than when he came, ran into the main hall, and quickly closed the door. "Don't come over, don't come over." An extremely terrified voice came from inside the palace door. Li Yi did not force his way in, although it was very easy for him. He stood at the door for a moment, put a jar of wine in front of the door, and left with Emingzu. After an unknown period of time, the palace door slowly opened. The king of Shu leaned against the door and picked up the jar of wine. After a moment of shock, he pulled out the cork and gulped it down. The wine poured down his neck. He looked up and laughed, but tears came out of his eyes. He suddenly smashed the wine jar and shouted, "I want to see Li Xian." The king of Shu no longer clamored to be the emperor. He walked out of the prison-like palace and entered a mausoleum. In that mausoleum, he was no longer restricted. It was a royal cemetery. After noble concubine Cui hanged herself, Li Xian specially allowed her to be buried there. Except for the empress, the concubines, and the especially favored concubines, all the concubines of the past emperors were buried there. And Li Yi was in the real imperial mausoleum. He brought a large jar of wine, a few dishes, and a bowl of white fungus and lotus seed soup. The temperature of the white fungus and lotus seed soup was a little too high, and the white fungus was boiled apart, which affected the taste. With Li Yi's cooking skills, he should not have made such a mistake. However, the first meal that the former emperor treated him to was this taste. Changde stood behind him, slightly absent-minded. Opposite Li Yi, there was a set of bowls and chopsticks, but no one was sitting there. He smiled and said, "Your Majesty, I hope you don't mind that I brought food and wine to see you after such a long time." He opened the jar of wine and poured half of it on the ground. "The Jing kingdom is getting better and better, and this is all thanks to you. Li Xian doesn't want to be the emperor, and I can't force him. I may not be able to do what I promised you in the past. Also, I admit that you are very wise, but you really gave birth to a silly son. But your daughters are all very good." Li Yi muttered to himself as he continued to drink. Before he knew it, he had finished the remaining half of the jar of wine. He was drunk and leaned on the table murmuring, "Usually no one dares to bring wine here. This time, you can drink to your heart's content. In the future, I will try to visit you once a year." Don't kick me in my sleep again. His Highness has probably already left Jingdo. There are still so many playboys in the capital. Zheng Tufu sighed and murmured, why did His Highness leave? In Hibiscus Garden, Li Xian held his son in his arms and swayed left and right. He also sighed and said, they leave just like that every time. 3 small figures ran over from afar. In the front was a little girl about 5 or 6 years old. She hugged his arm and said, Father, father, I want to learn martial arts. Li Xian nodded and said, learn. As long as your mother agrees, Imperial Father will also agree. Mother has agreed. The little girl smiled and said, I'll go find Aunt Emingzu. After saying this, she seemed to remember something and murmured, Aunt Emingzu is no longer in Jingdo. Then I'll go find little aunt. Oh, little aunt eloped with the prince consort. Li Xian looked at her in surprise and said, eloped? Who taught you that? The little girl rolled her eyes and said, little aunt said that when you leave with someone you like, it's called eloping. After saying this, she didn't wait for Li Xian to ask any questions and quickly ran away. Li Xian shook his head and stopped thinking about this matter. He lowered his head to look at the sleeping child and whispered, Zaire, you have to grow up quickly. In another part of Hibiscus Garden, 2 young girls walked hand in hand on the grass, chatting about something with smiles on their faces. Li Han held the kite string and followed behind the 2 of them. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up. However, when he thought of something, the corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up and turn into a bitter smile. In the military academy, a group of young people wearing thin clothes were swimming in the mud. Old General Shui stood at the side, holding a long whip in his hand and waving it from time to time. He then passed the whip to old General Ma beside him. In a restaurant in Jingdo, Tsing Shichen, Lu Dayo, and Lu Yi sat by the window. In another corner of the restaurant, a white-haired middle-aged man was drinking by himself. Beside him, a tall and sturdy man was making the woman singing in the restaurant giggle. In a shop not far from the restaurant, a fat man with bruises on his face pointed at a few workers and said unhappily, in the future, treat the customers like they are your wives and coax them. How do you coax your wives at home? How do you coax customers here? In a royal cemetery outside the city, a bearded young man waved a hoe and painstakingly cleared the weeds around a lone grave. In the Zhao Kingdom. 3 days ago, the imperial city of the Zhao Kingdom had been besieged by the army of the Qi Kingdom. 10 miles away from the imperial city, tents were erected one after another. Although it was night time, the tents were still brightly lit. Soldiers patrolled the area from time to time. The commander's tent in the center of the tents was completely dark. Coughing sounds could be heard from a small, inconspicuous tent. In front of Zhao Yi was a map. A city was drawn on the map. He had already circled a few of the city gates in red. A general looked at him and said worriedly, Your Majesty, Lord Yang has sent news that reinforcements from the Jing Kingdom will arrive in half a month. Zhao Yi opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His coughing became even more intense. Someone looked at him and couldn't help but say, Your Majesty, it's getting late. You'd better get some rest. We'll discuss this matter tomorrow. Zhao Yi covered his mouth and coughed for a while. Then his breathing gradually calmed down. He clenched his fist and waved his hand. In a slightly hoarse voice he said, Pass down my order. Tomorrow we attack the city. Yes, Your Majesty. Several generals in the tent shouted and half knelt on the ground at the same time. After everyone had left the tent, Zhao Yi unclenched his fist and stared blankly at the trace of blood on his palm. In the Wu Kingdom, it was late at night. In an even more serene hall in the depths of the imperial palace, the crown that symbolized the emperor had been worn for a long time was a little heavy. Yang Liuqing was still not used to it. She took it off and put it aside. Then she opened another booklet. She flipped through it and saw that it was the same content as before. Then she threw it aside. If those people still don't know what's good for them, I'll teach them a lesson myself. An old voice came from a corner of the hall. Yang Liuqing shook her head and said, In fact, what they said is not unreasonable. The old man looked surprised. You Yang Liuqing stood up and walked into the hall. Then she said, "In any case, I'll still pass the throne in the future. The next emperor of the Wu kingdom must also have the bloodline of the Yang family." The old man was gloomy for a moment and asked, "Among those people they proposed, is there anyone you like?" Yang Liuqing shook her head. The old man lowered his head and seemed to be thinking about something. A figure appeared in his mind with a slightly angry expression. "Bastard, you were so active at that time. Where have you gone now? This dress is very nice." A voice suddenly rang out in the hall. Yang Wanli's hair stood on end. He suddenly looked in a certain direction. The next moment, he breathed a sigh of relief. Then the expression on his face became even more shocked. You've broken through." Yang Liuqing's face lit up. She hurried over and said, "Master." Chapter 1171. It took him more than half a month to return to Suzhou from the capital city. Mainly in consideration of the two old ladies' health, Li deliberately slowed down. He would rather take a long detour than take the dangerous mountain path. It was just after the Lantern Festival when he left. When he arrived in Suzhou, it was almost April. Rui Li Mu and Li Jin accompanied the two old ladies. Shanning would not leave this time. Yongning was naturally happy. Li Duan was also very happy because Shanning spoiled him the most. His closeness to Shanning must have been established since she took care of him when he was a child. Whether it was the capital city or other places, Li always felt very depressed. As for Shu Prefecture and Rui City, they stood among the rolling mountains. Looking into the distance, they felt that every breath of air they breathed was free. He began to understand Li Xian a little. In addition to being more shameless than him, Li Xian also longed for freedom more than him. In April, the mountains were already covered with lush greenery. Li stood at the peak and looked down. Amidst the lush greenery of the mountain, there were light-colored ribbons that stretched far into the distance. It was a wide cement road that connected all the mountains. It was also the most important mountain path in the fringe lands. "What are you thinking about, my husband?" A soft voice came from behind him. Li turned around and saw Rui standing there. He had an illusion that Rui seemed to be standing there the whole time. Whether he was in Qing'an Prefecture, the capital city, the Qi Kingdom, or the Wu Kingdom, it seemed that there was always a figure standing behind him. He could see her as soon as he turned around. Lying on the grass, Li put his hands behind his head and said, "I had a dream last night. I dreamed that one day when I woke up, I was in another place." Sitting beside him, Rui bent her legs and asked, "What kind of place was it?" Li thought for a moment and said, "A very large library, surrounded by bookshelves. The bookshelves were filled with books that could not be finished in a lifetime. When I woke up, you, Rui, and Xiaohuan were not beside me. It was as if I was a person from another world, and everything here was just a dream." In fact, Li often had such a dream. He often woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep anymore. Putting her hand on his head, Rui gently pressed it and said, "You must be too tired, my husband. I have been here the whole time." Li held her hand and said, "What if I really came from another world?" Looking down at him, Rui said, "My husband came from another world. Actually, I have something that I have been hiding from you." She took a deep breath as if she had made a big decision. Looking at Li, she said seriously, "Actually, I am a fairy from heaven. I accidentally fell into the mortal world and lost my mana." Li was startled. After staring at her for a long time, he suddenly sat up and pushed her down on the grass. Smiling, he said, "Is that so? My wife is a fairy. Then I want to see how a fairy from heaven is different from a woman in the mortal world." Rui was a grandmaster. Li couldn't beat her, but when he teased her, she was just a weak woman. This was different from Rui. After a while, her breathing became a little rapid. She moved away from Li's hand and said hurriedly, "My husband, don't make trouble." Li rested his head on her lap and said, "Fortunately, I didn't run away the night Rui took me up the mountain. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to marry such a fairy wife." Rui looked at him and said in surprise, "You wanted to run away at that time?" "Of course I do." Li nodded and said, "I didn't know you were such a fairy at that time. What if you were a man with a face full of fat and weighed 200 pounds? I might as well die. Rui combed her slightly messy hair and asked with interest. Then why didn't you run away later? Were you subdued by my beauty? Do you want to hear the truth or a lie? Rui thought for a while and said, lie first. Lie. Li looked at her and said, of course. I found out that you were such a peerless beauty. I was subdued by your beauty. When you opened the door and came in, I even thought of the names Dwainer and Xiaomu. That's a lie. Rui looked at him with a smile. She moved her hand away from his head and put it on his waist. She asked, what's the truth? Feeling the movement on his waist, Li smiled and said, what truth? What I said just now was the truth. It couldn't be more true. He immediately felt a pain on his waist. Rui looked at him and said, if you don't say it, you can sleep with Sister Emingzu or Sister Wanru tonight. Of course not. Emingzu and Wanru hadn't entered the room yet. They definitely wouldn't let him enter the room. Although Rui usually didn't fight for anything, Ruoqing and Zuemo would definitely listen to her. Not to mention Xiao Huanli thought for a while and said, actually, I wanted to wait for you to come in, knock you out, and then run. But then you smashed the solid wooden table with a single slap. Li was still a little scared when he thought about it. If I ran at that time, would you hit me? Yes. Rui nodded without hesitation and said, I would still do it now. There was no good result from telling the truth. Every once in a while Li would be able to come up with a famous saying. Women only wanted to listen to good things, regardless of whether they were true or not. This was like how they could say they weren't beautiful, that their faces were thick, and that their buttocks were round, but men definitely couldn't go along with what they said. Otherwise, they would be courting death. Lies would always be rewarded with erotic rewards. If he told the truth, he would be beaten. Rui had been violent for so many years, and she began to learn Rui's gentleness. Rui had been gentle for so many years, and she began to learn Rui's violence. Li felt that he might have discovered a theorem. Between sisters, the theorem of gentleness never changes, or the theorem of violence never changes. Gentleness wouldn't disappear out of thin air, nor would it appear out of thin air. It could only be transferred from one sister to another, and the total amount would always remain the same. The same was true of violence. How to find the balance between them was a problem that he needed to study in depth in the next few years, decades, or even decades. He was also puzzled by another question. Why was it that when Rui was violent, not only did he not hate it, but he would feel a kind of pleasure in his heart? This might be a kind of self-comfort, out of a human sense of self-protection. After all, there were already 3 grandmasters in his family, Rui, and Emingzu. In this life, no matter what, even if he became a grandmaster, he would not be able to make a comeback. If he couldn't change the reality, then he would change himself. If he couldn't resist, then he would enjoy it. As for why he liked this kind of Rui, it was because this kind of Rui was more real. This was not the awakening of his masochism. This was love. Li rubbed his buttocks, and Rui used his arm as a pillow. Suddenly she said, husband, let's go to find Rui. Shuzhou Jiang of Sila's mansion. Li Duan skipped into a room, and soon ran out. He held a piece of paper in his hand, ran to third Miss Chun, who had just walked into the yard and said in panic, Grandma, bad news, father and mother eloped. Chapter 1172. In the room, Shanning rubbed Li Duan's head and said, they didn't elope. They went to find Aunt. Li Duan was relieved and murmured, I thought father and mother didn't want me and Xiao Mu and Xiao Jin anymore. Shanning comforted him, and then bent down to look at him. She asked, now can you tell me who taught you to elope? Li Duan was startled and ran outside, but Shanning grabbed his ear. Shanning pinched his face and said, you're so young. You should learn to elope. Didn't Xiaonyang elope with father? You even learned to talk back. Is your butt itching again? Li Duan covered his ears and his heart sank. Xiaonyang changed. Xiaonyang was no longer the Xiaonyang who bought him candies. How did Xiaonyang change? It seemed that he couldn't tell Xiaonyang about eloping with Xiao Rui, but he could tell Xiao Mu. Xiao Mu was still young and didn't even know what eloping was. He didn't need to be afraid of others knowing, and he didn't need to keep it to himself. Shaoning slapped Li Duan's but a few times and told him to study hard and practice martial arts. Then she went to another yard. Emingzu sat in the study and opened an envelope. Xu Ning walked in. Seeing that she was reading carefully, he stuck his head out to take a look. This letter was a spy from the imperial court. The Jing kingdom sent 30,000 soldiers and 100,000 soldiers from the Zhao kingdom to the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom as reinforcements. This time, the emperor of the Qi kingdom led 300,000 soldiers. Of course, this 100,000 soldiers were not enough. However, there were still more than 100,000 soldiers in the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom. With the help of Tian Fa, they didn't need to fear the Qi kingdom. This letter arrived today, which meant that they had been in the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom for at least a month. The next letter should be the news of victory. She sat down at the desk and said, "Royal sister, we're already here. Why are you still reading these things?" This time, the Jing kingdom supported Zhao against Qi, not because the Jing kingdom had nowhere to use its power, nor was it a whim of the imperial court. It was a decision made after much consideration. This involved a series of political and interest factors, and to a large extent, it would change the structure of the countries in the next few decades. However, Xu Ning would not understand these things. She put down the letter and asked, "Aren't you teaching Yongning martial arts? Why is she here again?" Xiaomu pestered her to go play on the slide. Shaoning took the letter and looked at it. She shook her head and said, "When will Xiao Rui come? It's more lively when there are more people." May of the 5th year of Jinghe. It was the end of spring and the beginning of summer, one of the most pleasant months of the year. In May, not only did the warm wind of early summer sweep across the land, but there was also a thunderous news. In the lotus garden of the Jing kingdom, when Li Xian woke up from his afternoon nap, he found several old generals standing in front of the palace with solemn expressions. In the Wu kingdom, the imperial court meeting had just ended. The officials walked out of the main hall, their faces still filled with disbelief. A month ago, the capital of the Zhao kingdom, Qiang, was conquered by the Qi kingdom. The civil and military officials in the imperial city, including the king of the Zhao kingdom, were all captured. The reinforcements, including the 30,000 elites of the Jing kingdom, were all captured, except for those who died in battle. It was said that the Qi kingdom soldiers suffered great losses because of the heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom during the battle. However, not long after the two armies started fighting, the sunny weather suddenly became overcast with dark clouds. Sand and pebbles flew everywhere, followed by heavy rain. The heavenly punishment lost its power, and the army of the Qi kingdom turned the tide in a short period of time, winning the Battle of Qiang. Thus, the Zhao kingdom was destroyed. In the Jing kingdom, the morning court meeting, which had not been held for many days, had lasted for several hours today. The army of the Jing kingdom, which had been invincible and had created many legends, had suffered a setback for the first time in these years. The soldiers and generals who were captured by the Qi kingdom were a problem that needed to be dealt with. The defeat of this battle was also very important. A civil official said with great regret, "This is an unfavorable time. If it weren't for the heavenly punishment, our army would have been defeated." Bulsh *T. Old General Shui did not care that this was the court meeting. He pointed at his nose and scolded, "Is the Jing kingdom's army only relying on heavenly punishment?" Old General Ma was so angry that his beard was trembling. He pointed at his nose and shouted, "The Qi kingdom has 300,000 soldiers. That's an army of 300,000 soldiers, not 300,000 pigs." With heavenly punishment, the Jing kingdom had obtained countless victories in the past few years. This caused most people in the court to forget how powerful the Qi kingdom was in the past. The strength of the country and the strength of the army allowed them to crush and humiliate the Jing kingdom for decades. Although heavenly punishment had given the Jing kingdom a few years to turn around, the Qi kingdom was still the Qi kingdom. They had not become weaker. Without heavenly punishment, the Jing kingdom would not have much of an advantage against the Qi kingdom. Moreover, this time, they were fighting against the Qi kingdom's 300,000 soldiers with only 100,000 soldiers. This was a heavy blow to the Jing kingdom from the Qi kingdom. However, for the Jing kingdom, the significance of this incident was more than just a crushing defeat. The Minister of War Yanbing stepped forward and bowed. Your Majesty, for the safety of the captured soldiers, we need to send messengers to negotiate with the Qi kingdom as soon as possible. The capital governor, Lu Dayo, pondered for a long time. Finally, he stepped forward and said, Your Majesty, the captured soldiers are important. But this time, the Zhao kingdom has brought a large amount of heavenly punishment. I'm afraid that it has fallen into the hands of the Qi kingdom. If they obtain the formula of heavenly punishment. Lu Dayo did not finish his words, but the entire imperial court broke out in a cold sweat and fright. Heavenly punishment was the Jing kingdom's divine weapon. They all knew very well how powerful it was. If the formula of heavenly punishment fell into the hands of the Qi kingdom, they dared not imagine the consequences. They could not afford to bear it. This meant that in the future, every war with the Qi kingdom would be a war of heavenly punishment. There would be more casualties than any previous war. This meant that the Jing kingdom's military advantage, which they had painstakingly built up, would be gone. After the morning court session ended, it seemed that the entire sky above the capital city was shrouded in a layer of dark clouds. In a restaurant in a certain province of the Wu kingdom, the Qi kingdom has annihilated the Zhao kingdom. The Zhao kingdom is gone just like that? That's right. Even the emperor has been captured. And the Jing kingdom's reinforcements have also become prisoners. Doesn't the Jing kingdom have heavenly punishment? How could they lose? It's said that the Jing kingdom's army gained a lot of advantages by relying on heavenly punishment. However, when the emperor of the Qi kingdom personally led the army to stand on the city wall, the weather was sunny. Suddenly, a strong wind blew and heavy rain poured down. The heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom became useless. I heard that the Qi kingdom's emperor invited the Sea Dragon King to help and extinguish the heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom. The small restaurant was now crowded with people. The destruction of the Zhao kingdom was a big deal to them, because the Zhao kingdom had always been stronger than the Wu kingdom. Even the Zhao kingdom was destroyed by the Qi kingdom. If the Qi kingdom pointed its blade at them, would the Wu kingdom be able to withstand it? In a very short time, the whole restaurant was in a state of panic. In a remote corner of the restaurant, Li Yi withdrew his gaze from the crowd. The Zhao kingdom was gone. The Jing kingdom had been defeated. The heavenly punishment had fallen into the hands of Zhao Yi. He and Ru Yi had only come out for a short while, and this world had already undergone such a huge change. He was not worried that Zhao Yi could figure out the formula of heavenly punishment. In fact, Zhao Yi should have known the materials needed to make heavenly punishment. The important thing was the proportion. The Zhao kingdom should have collected a lot of heavenly punishment from the battlefield. It was not meaningful to get the heavenly punishment this time. He did not know how many heavenly punishments the Jing kingdom had brought this time. The more they brought, the more they would have to bear in the future. However, what was more important than the formula of heavenly punishment was the person Zhao Yi, flying sand and stones, summoning wind and rain. This was the son of the plain. Chapter 1173. There was a famous battle in history called the Battle of Kuanyang. In the Battle of Kuanyang, Lu Xiu defeated Wang Meng's army of 400,000 with only 20,000 soldiers. This was a famous example of a battle in which one side defeated many, 20,000 people against more than 400,000. This seemed like an impossible task. However, in the Battle of Kuanyang, a meteor flew into the enemy's camp. During the battle, strong winds blew and torrential rain poured. In an extremely short period of time, many extremely bad weather conditions appeared. With the help of the celestial phenomenon, Lu Xiu won the Battle of Kuanyang, which seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Because of this, Emperor Guangwu of Han was jokingly called the Son of the Dimension, and the Great Magister, by later generations. Although Zhao Yi didn't summon meteors to help like Emperor Guangwu, the news of him inviting the Sea Dragon King had already spread to several countries. Li Yi didn't really believe in the Son of the Dimension and luck. However, he couldn't deny that Zhao Yi's luck was extremely good. Rui sat beside him and said softly, "Husband." Li retracted his gaze and shook his head. "It's okay. We've finished eating and rested for the night. In less than 10 days, we'll reach the Wu Kingdom's imperial capital." He had expected the Qi Kingdom to defeat the Zhao Kingdom, but he didn't expect it to be so fast. They practically swept through everything in their way and headed straight for the Zhao Kingdom's imperial capital. Although they could conquer the Zhao Kingdom in an extremely short period of time, it exposed a bigger problem. After conquering the Zhao Kingdom, they would need to spend a lot of effort to suppress the rebels in the Zhao Kingdom. This would take a very long time. This wasn't Zhao Yi's style of doing things. A hint of doubt appeared on Li Yi's face. What was Zhao Yi so anxious about? Zhao Kingdom, Qiang. The original capital had become the capital of a fallen country. A month ago, Qiang City was conquered. The king of the Zhao Kingdom and his concubines, the royal family of the Zhao Kingdom, and all the officials were captured. Inside the palace, the officials gathered together once again. "Your Majesty committed suicide for his country yesterday." A middle-aged scholar stood in front of the hall and said calmly, "A fine bird chooses a good tree to nest in. Grand Tutor, the Zhao Kingdom has fallen. Why are you so stubborn?" "Ha ha." Opposite him, a white-haired old man threw his head back and laughed wildly. "A loyal subject does not serve two masters. The Zhao Kingdom has fallen. His Majesty has died for his country. I, along with the Zhao Kingdom, will die with His Majesty." He turned around, looked at the crowd behind him and shouted, "Who's going with this old man?" A middle-aged official stepped forward and laughed. "This lowly official is willing to go with Grand Tutor." A young official walked out and shouted, "I'm willing to die with you. Since the country has fallen, your subject shall die. The ministers of a fallen nation have no face to continue living. Let's go together." In an instant, more than 10 figures stepped forward. "Fellow colleagues, this old man will take his leave first." The white-haired old man laughed, stamped his feet, and hit his head on a pillar in the hall. He died instantly. Grand Tutor's legs are not good. This lowly official will also go first. On the way to hell, he will have a walking stick. An official smiled, suddenly pulled out a guard's long saber, and cut his own neck. "You are only a 5th-rank official. How dare you compete with me for the walking stick of the Grand Tutor?" Another official snorted, picked up the long saber on the ground, put it to his neck and cut it open. "Your Majesty, I'm coming with you." Soon more than 30 bodies were piled up in the hall. Even the surrounding guards had looks of horror on their faces. They couldn't help but distance themselves from the corpses. The middle-aged scholar watched them die one by one, with a calm expression on his face. When the last person shouted, "Die with the country," and stabbed his long saber into his own heart, the crowd was dead silent. Some people were angry, some were ashamed. But in the end, no one walked out. Cough, cough. A few coughs came from outside the hall, and a figure slowly walked into the hall. The middle-aged scholar hurried forward and said worriedly, "Your Majesty." Zhao Yi waved his hand and refused his help. He looked at the corpses in the hall for a long time, then said, "Bury them." The middle-aged scholar nodded and bowed. "As you wish." A person walked in from outside the hall and said in a low voice, "Your Majesty, the envoy of the Jing Kingdom has arrived." Zhao Yi nodded and said, "Bring them to the side hall." The middle-aged scholar looked at him and said, "Your Majesty, you should rest for a while. The imperial physician said you can't continue like this." Zhao Yi waved his hand and said in a hoarse voice, "It's okay." The middle-aged scholar's expression changed. He looked at him but did not say anything. In a side hall of the imperial palace, several officials of the Jing Kingdom were waiting anxiously. This time, the number of soldiers of the Jing Kingdom who had been captured by the Qi Kingdom was more than 10,000. When they learned the news, they didn't wait for the imperial court's order and rushed here day and night. They had to bring back these 10,000 soldiers in one piece no matter what. It was 10,000 lives. It was not hard to imagine what harsh conditions the Qi Kingdom would offer. This would be an invisible war, and the success or failure of the war depended on them. The door of the side hall was pushed open. They immediately stood up and looked at the door. It was a young man who walked in. Judging by his age, he should be about the same age as their majesty. But his face was a bit pale, and his steps were a bit unsteady. It seemed that he was not in good health. The leader was about to say something. Zhao Yi waved his hand and asked, "You are here for the captives?" "Yes." The man looked serious and said in a deep voice, "We are here to redeem the 10,000 soldiers of the Jing kingdom. Please give us a condition, Emperor Qi." Zhao Yi was silent for a while. He looked at him and asked, "Do you have a penny?" The ambassadors of the Jing kingdom walked out of the side hall. The sunlight outside sprinkled on them, and they became a little more clear-headed. One of them suddenly looked at his companion and said, "Lord Chen, slap me and see if it hurts." "Pa." The man slapped him hard on the face without hesitation. Then he lowered his head and looked at his hand, murmuring, "It hurts. It's real." Half of the official's face immediately swelled up. Blood seeped out of the corner of his mouth. One of his teeth even loosened. He looked at Lord Chen with a bewildered expression. The official with the surname Chen patted him on the shoulder. He looked at his bewildered expression and said, "Lord Wei, you don't have to doubt it. What happened just now was real." He knew why Lord Wei was bewildered. It was because he was also bewildered. They had long been convinced that the Qi kingdom would have to pay a great price to release the 10,000 captives. The Qi kingdom would certainly offer a condition that they could not imagine. The condition that the Qi kingdom offered was indeed beyond their imagination. The condition was a penny. 1 copper coin could not buy a loss, and 1 copper coin could not buy a trick. 1 copper coin could bring all the captives back. Those captives had been detained for nearly 2 months. During these days, their food and expenses added up to a terrifying figure. However, Emperor Qi did sign the document for the release of the captives only after paying them a penny. They only needed to bring this document with them to bring all the generals of the Jing kingdom back home. This negotiation mission had been completed beyond imagination. Not to mention the rewards he would receive when he returned, he could even look forward to having his name recorded in the annals of history. The two left in a hurry without thinking too much. Before Emperor Qi went back on his word, they had to settle this matter in the shortest time possible. By the time they brought all the generals and soldiers out of here, it would be too late for him to go back on his word. In the side hall, Zhao Yi sat alone in front of a table. In front of him was a huge map. On the map, it was clearly divided into 4 regions. The Jing kingdom, the Wu kingdom, the Qi kingdom after annexing the Zhao kingdom, and the dozens of small countries in the west. Among them, the Qi kingdom was the largest. It was almost the size of the Jing kingdom and the Wu kingdom combined. The dozens of small countries in the west were also the size of the Wu kingdom. His eyes fell on the westernmost region. Then he began to cough. He covered his mouth and coughed hard, spitting out a mouthful of blood. Chapter 1174. In the imperial palace of the Zhao kingdom, the generals of the Qi kingdom gathered in front of a palace. Inside the palace, an old man with white hair and beard stood in front of the bed. He said solemnly, "Your Majesty, you can't go on like this." Zhao Yi's face was as pale as a piece of paper. He smiled and looked at the old man. He asked calmly, "How much longer do I have?" The old man lowered his head and thought for a while. He said, "If your Majesty can stop, I can extend your life for another 1.5 years." A general walked in from outside the palace and said anxiously, "Your Majesty, how can you release the prisoners of the Jing kingdom just like that? Get out." Before Zhao Yi could speak, the old man turned his head and said coldly to him. The general looked at him, shrank his head, and walked out dejectedly. Outside the palace, a general glanced at him and said, "Dr. Hua said not to let those trifles disturb His Majesty's thoughts and waste his energy. Why are you going to join in the fun at this time?" The general showed an unconvinced expression and said, "That's 10,000 people. Even if we can't exchange them for divine punishment from Jinggua, we can still exchange them for a lot of other things. These days they've eaten a lot of our food. Have you calculated how much we've lost if His Majesty just let them go like this? Is this the first time you understand His Majesty's character?" The general looked at him and said, "It is because they are from the Jing kingdom that His Majesty released them." Hearing this, the general sighed and said no more. When the crown prince besieged the city, His Majesty, as the third prince, owed that person a huge favor. Given His Majesty's character, he would naturally return the favor. Speaking of which, compared to the fool who gave the Qi kingdom to His Majesty, the 10,000 prisoners that His Majesty gave to the Jing kingdom were really not enough. Thinking of this, His Majesty felt much better. He could only let out a long sigh as he watched a huge piece of meat slip away from their mouths. In the palace, the old man looked at Zhao Yi and said seriously, "Your Majesty, let's stop here. I will do my best to nurse Your Majesty's body. Don't worry." Zhao Yi smiled and said, "Our journey has just begun. I don't want to die yet." He looked outside and said, "When Mr. Hua goes out, call them in." The old man frowned. "Your Majesty," Zhao Yi smiled. "Just a few words." The old man looked at him, and could only sigh in the end. He walked to the door and glared fiercely at the generals, saying, "After you go in, be careful what you say. If His Majesty's condition worsens, I won't forgive you." A few of the Qi Kingdom's generals, who were known for their decisiveness on the battlefield, lowered their heads and nodded in agreement. They would rather offend Her Majesty than miracle Dr. Hua, because no one knew what kind of suffering awaited them if they offended miracle Dr. Hua, who was known for his narrow-mindedness. When they walked into the hall, Zhao Yi had already gotten up from his bed and was looking at the huge map. He looked at the generals who came in and said, "I'll leave the rest to you." In an instant, several of them half knelt on the ground and shouted, "We will obey Your Majesty's decree." The Jing Kingdom. An urgent letter had arrived at the front, causing the morning court session to last an hour longer than usual. An official stood in front of the hall and asked in surprise, "Your Majesty, the Qi Kingdom has released him without any request. Could there be a trap? We have to be on our guard." Another official stood up and said, "Lord Chen and the others have already brought him back to the Jing Kingdom. What other tricks could there be? Perhaps the Qi Kingdom is afraid of the Jing Kingdom's prestige and is showing weakness? I think it's highly possible." In the court, as the officials were discussing, the capital governor Lu Dayo walked out from the crowd. He cleared his throat and took out a piece of paper from his sleeve, saying, "I've done some research a few days ago. Why don't you take a look?" There was no one in the imperial court who didn't know that this capital governor didn't seem to reveal himself. He might not say a single word in the imperial court for several months on end, but every time he did speak, it was always to the point, even earth-shattering. Therefore, they were still a little afraid of this Lord Lu. The piece of paper he took out this time did not contain any profound or esoteric remarks, but a few sets of simple numbers. The Qi Kingdom, the Jing Kingdom, the Wu Kingdom, and the destroyed Zhao Kingdom accounted for 60% of the famous generals who were active on the battlefield and were well known to the world. From the time the Qi Kingdom attacked the Zhao Kingdom to the time the Zhao Kingdom was destroyed, only 4 months had passed. Before the appearance of Tianfa, the Qi Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom had fought dozens of battles, big and small, and the Jing Kingdom had lost 80% of the battles. After the Qi Kingdom destroyed the Zhao Kingdom, it launched a large-scale expedition to the west. As of today, 7 small countries in the west had been incorporated into the territory of the Qi Kingdom. This thin piece of paper and the data recorded on it were like a vicious slap to the faces of all the courtiers in the hall. This piece of paper told them that without Tianfa, the Jing Kingdom's military strength was far inferior to the Qi Kingdom's. In recent years, the Jing Kingdom's economy had taken off, and the people's lives were stable. Basically, it had reached the peak since the founding of the country. In terms of military strength, with the advantage of Tianfa, the other countries were deterred. Even the Qi Kingdom could not stop its edge. However, without Tianfa, there was not much difference between the Jing Kingdom and the Zhao Kingdom. If the Qi Kingdom could conquer the capital city of the Zhao Kingdom in just 4 months, it was possible that it could conquer the capital city in a year. Now the Qi Kingdom also had Tianfa. Although it was only a small number, if it was used on the Jing Kingdom, they would definitely pay a very painful price. This slap woke up many of the officials in the court. It turned out that the Jing Kingdom was not as powerful as they had imagined. It turned out that the Qi Kingdom was still the invincible Qi Kingdom. However, after destroying the state of Zhao and releasing the captives of the state of Jing, they actually continued to march westward without stopping. Could it be that this newly ascended emperor of the state of Qi was truly a madman? The court below was almost silent. Li Xian rubbed the area between his eyebrows, which was a little swollen, and murmured, "What is the surname Zhao doing?" When Li Yi learned that Zhao Yi had unconditionally released the captives of the Jing kingdom, he was already in a province of the Wu kingdom, which was only a day's journey away from the imperial capital. Was this a return of his favor? If he thought about it carefully, he had given Zhao Yi the Qi kingdom. Although the favor he returned was great, it was still not enough compared to the throne of the Qi kingdom. Zhao Yi had already conquered the Zhao kingdom and was advancing toward his goal of ruling the world. When he completely conquered the 20 small countries in the west, there would only be the Jing kingdom, the Wu kingdom, and the super big Qi kingdom on this continent. Li felt a little uncomfortable in his heart. She was the ruler of the entire world. Did she really think that she could conquer the entire world just because she said so? Why did it seem like a game to her? She was a huge country that could be conquered and destroyed as she pleased. Why hadn't she realized how formidable Zhao Yi was in the past? When she was trapped in the royal capital by Zhao Zheng, she was just like a cowardly tortoise. Could it be that after giving away the throne of the Qi kingdom, he had awakened some mysterious attribute and was blessed with luck? Was he really going to become the next emperor to unify the world? It was no exaggeration to say that Li Yi had mixed feelings at this moment. If one day, Zhao Yi pointed his sword at the Jing kingdom or the Wu kingdom, what should he do? It was not that he was afraid of Zhao Yi, but he was ready to completely enter the life of retirement after a period of time. Fighting back and forth, he could not live a peaceful life. Chapter 1175. In a certain hall in the imperial palace of the Wu kingdom, Yang Liuqing placed a letter on the table and said, "Master, Uncle Master and the others should arrive tomorrow." Mississippi Lu put down the martial arts books collected by the royal family of the Wu kingdom and stood up to walk out of the palace. Yang Liuqing watched her walk out and sighed softly. She walked out of the hall and said to Chen Qing, who was waiting there, "Tomorrow, the two Uncle Masters will arrive at the imperial capital. I'll have to trouble General Chen to welcome them on my behalf." Chen Qing hurriedly said, "It's no trouble at all. I haven't seen Prince Jiang of Silla for a long time." Chen Qing had followed Yang Liuqing from the land of chaos and fought his way to the imperial capital. He was one of the important officials who assisted Yang Liuqing in his ascension to the throne. His status was equivalent to that of a founding general and was completely different from how it was a few years ago. Even when envoys from the Jing kingdom or the Qi kingdom came, he didn't need to personally go out of the city to welcome them. However, it was different this time. After receiving the order, he hurriedly left. If he didn't bring Wei Liang along to welcome Jiang of Silla tomorrow, he would probably not be finished with him in the future. He would also have to bring Blind Fan along. They had all received kindness and guidance from Jiang of Silla, so these etiquettes were necessary. Mississippi Lu returned to the hall and took out autumn water. She said to Yang Liuqing, "I'll be away for a period of time. Even though you're tired from state affairs, you can't neglect your martial arts. This will be very beneficial to you." Yang Liuqing nodded and said, "I understand." Not long after, the white-haired elder walked into the hall and asked in confusion, "Why did your master leave?" Yang Liuqing thought for a while and said, "Master, she has some matters to deal with." Yang Wanli didn't pursue this matter and suddenly asked, "I heard that Li Brat is coming?" Yang Liuqing nodded and said, "Martial uncle will arrive tomorrow." "That's good." A smile appeared on Yang Wanli's face as he said, "This kid has a lot of wicked ideas and a belly full of evil tricks. When the time comes, let him help you come up with more ideas." Li Yi had seen the capital cities of the Jing kingdom, the Qi kingdom, and the Wu kingdom. Putting aside personal feelings, the capital of the Qi kingdom should be the most imposing, at least from the outside. Of course, all in all, the capital was more prosperous. The Wu kingdom's imperial city was the most wretched of the three. Along the way, Li Yi and Rui learned more about Wu Guogua. After a decade of turmoil, the Wu kingdom wanted to restore its foundation. It was a long-term task, and not something that could be done in a short period of time. Yang Liuqing had just ascended to the throne not long ago. Everything in the Wu Kingdom was waiting to be done. Although she had a small notebook that he had specially made for her, nothing could be done in one go. After the civil war ended, the Wu Kingdom's tianfa was no longer supplied to them in the fringe. Li Yi didn't think it was necessary in the past. But now he might have to change his plan. Every few days, he would hear the news that the Qi Kingdom had annihilated a small country in the west. With the Qi Kingdom's current strength, it was only a matter of time before they swept through the countries in the west. When that time came, on this continent, only the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom would be left standing in his way of becoming the ruler of the world. If the Qi Kingdom went all out, the Wu Kingdom might not be able to win even with tianfa. If there was no tianfa, then the Zhao Kingdom might very well be a lesson for them. Of course, the Jing Kingdom wouldn't just watch as the Qi Kingdom annexed all the other countries. When that time came, it would truly be time for the reshuffling of the powers on this continent. He and Rui entered the city gate and asked for the location of the imperial palace. Then they walked in that direction. Rui sighed softly and said, "My husband wrote that letter first. If Rui knew that we've arrived, I'm afraid she would hide on purpose." Of course, Li Yi knew that Mississippi Lu would hide on purpose. But if she hadn't figured it out, even if he and Rui appeared without a trace, she would still leave, and it would be more serious than if she had taken the initiative to hide. Li Yi smiled and held her hand. He said, "It doesn't matter. We have nothing to do anyway. We'll chase after her wherever she hides. When she's tired of hiding, she'll naturally come out." The imperial city of the Wu Kingdom was indeed shabby. The roads were full of potholes and sewage and garbage were everywhere. It couldn't even compare to a second-tier city in the Jing Kingdom, let alone the capital, which had all been replaced with cement roads. Even the main roads of the important cities in the Jiangyi region of the Qi Kingdom were paved with neatly cut bluestone slabs. Of course, this was also due to Li Yi's own negligence. The little notebook he gave to Yang Liuqing recorded mostly revolutionary experiences. He also touched a little on how to govern the country after seizing the fruits of victory. But there was no mention of these basic constructions. "Get out of the way, get out of the way!" A fine horse galloped from behind, and the pedestrians on the street all dodged to the side. Li Yi and Rui stood on the side of the street and frowned as they watched the young man on the horse galloping away with laughter. There was actually someone galloping wildly on a horse on the main street of the capital. How did Yang Liuqing become the empress? He bent over to help an old man who had accidentally fallen to the ground while dodging. He couldn't help but ask, "There's someone galloping wildly on a horse on the streets of the imperial city. Doesn't the authorities care?" The old man sighed and asked, "Young master, you're not from here, are you?" Li Yi nodded. "There's something you don't know, young master." The old man looked ahead and said, "That person on the horse just now is the young master of the Zhang family. There are several members of the Zhang family who are high-ranking officials in the imperial court. When His Majesty was suppressing that usurper, the Zhang family helped His Majesty a lot. How could the authorities dare to care about this kind of thing? Even if someone really died from the collision, it would be in vain." The His Majesty that the old man was talking about was naturally Yang Liuqing. When Yang Liuqing and the others attacked the imperial city of the Wu Kingdom, they actually didn't expend too much effort, and they didn't use heavenly punishment either. It could even be said that they didn't expend much effort. Because at that time, the original tyrant of the Wu Kingdom was already disloyal. The officials, nobles, and various great clans in the imperial city all wanted nothing more than to overthrow his tyranny. When Yang Liuqing and the others fought their way here, the gates of the imperial city were wide open, and the commoners lined the streets to welcome them. They very easily entered the imperial city, but this wasn't a reason for her to indulge these clans. Or perhaps she herself didn't know that these people were actually so arrogant in the imperial city. But no matter what the reason was, if her little martial nephew wanted to become a qualified empress, she still had a very long way to go. She still needed to train her well. There was no training. "Mother, I want to eat candied hawthorn." On the streets of the imperial city, A little girl pointed at a hawker selling candied hawthorn in the middle of the street. She turned her head, looked at her mother, and begged. The woman took out 2 copper coins from her bosom, handed them to her, and said, "I only have 2 copper coins. Go and ask how much 1 candied hawthorn costs." The little girl immediately revealed a smile, and her eyes curved into crescent moons. She ran to the middle of the street, opened her hand, and revealed the 2 copper coins in her hand. She said, "Brother, brother, I want 1 candied hawthorn." The hawker selling the candied hawkers was a youth about 17 or 18 years old. He held a stick in his hand, and on top of the stick was a raised haystack. The haystack was filled with candied hawthorns. He looked at the 2 copper coins in the little girl's hand, rubbed his head, and said with some embarrassment, "My candied hawthorn, 3 copper coins each." The little girl's eyes instantly dimmed. She made an "oh" sound, and turned to walk outside. The youth stood in the courtyard, thought for a moment, and suddenly said, "Little sister, wait a moment." He took a candied hawthorn from the haystack, handed it to her, and said, "Forget it, I'll sell 1 to you for 2 copper coins. Don't tell anyone else. If I sell all of them for 2 copper coins, I'll lose money." The little girl immediately smiled, took the candied hawthorn, and nodded heavily, saying, "Thank you, brother." The youth smiled, turned to leave, and shouted, candied hawthorn, sour and sweet candied hawthorn." The little girl stood in the middle of the street, licked the candied hawthorn, and showed a happy smile. "Get out of the way." On the street, the crowd dodged, and a fast horse galloped from behind. The woman looked at the little girl standing in the middle of the street, and her face instantly turned pale. She cried out involuntarily, "Little girl." The little girl looked up and saw a big horse rushing towards her. Her body trembled, and the candied hawthorn in her hand fell to the ground. Bang! An extremely dull sound suddenly rang out. The horse fell to the ground, and its head was already broken, and it was no longer breathing. The youth on the horse flew straight out. After landing, his body bent in a strange way, and he lay on the ground, howling miserably. The young man selling the candied hawthorn looked at the scattered candied hawthorn on the ground, and his face showed a look of pity. The candied hawthorn scattered on the ground, and the haystack at the top of the stick also flew out. He pulled off the gray cloth that wrapped the stick, and everyone could see that it was not a wooden stick at all, but an iron stick as thick as a child's arm. It was also because of this that he was able to smash the horse to death with 1 strike. However, this youth was really strong, and such a thick iron stick in his hand seemed to be weightless. The little girl had already recovered from the shock, and she looked at the youth in a daze and murmured, "Brother, you're so powerful as sun dashing." The youth was stunned when he heard this, and he turned the iron stick in his hand, and said embarrassedly, "Is that so? Actually, many people say that." Chapter 1176. Sun Dashing was a character in Journey to the West. The story and drama of Journey to the West could often be heard in the brothel. According to Journey to the West, Sun Dashing was omnipotent and omnipotent. He had the 72 transformations, the fiery eyes, and the somersault cloud. He was the envy of almost all children. Many boys held a wooden stick in their hands and shouted, "I old Sun am going." Then they hypnotized themselves into thinking that they were Sun Wukong. Therefore, when that brother waved the stick in his hand and saved her, the little girl took it for granted that he was Sun Dashing. After being praised by the little girl, the young man's face turned slightly red. He looked at the candied fruits scattered on the ground, and felt a little distressed. The woman had already rushed over at this moment. She held the little girl in her arms and asked worriedly, "Girl, are you okay?" The little girl raised her chubby little hand and wiped the tears off the woman's face. She said, "Mother, I'm fine. This big brother saved me." The woman came back to her senses and quickly looked at the young man. She said anxiously, "Benefactor, leave quickly. That person is the young master of the Zhang family. The Zhang family will definitely not let you off." The young man shook his head indifferently and said, "If they come to catch me, I'll beat them up. If they come, I'll beat them up. If they come, I'll beat them up. If they come, I'll beat them up. No matter how many come, I'll beat them up. Benefactor. The woman looked anxious. Just as she was about to speak, there was already a commotion in front. A group of bailiffs separated the crowd and walked over. They said lazily, "What happened? Why are you all gathered here?" When the leader saw the young man lying on the ground, the laziness on his face suddenly disappeared. He said in panic, Mr. Zhang, what happened to you?" At this moment, Mr. Zhang had already fainted from the pain. One of them hurriedly squatted down. After checking, he licked his dry lips and said, "Detective Zhao, Mr. Zhang's limbs are all broken." Detective Zhao looked at Mr. Zhang's twisted limbs and said in a trembling voice, Is he still alive?" The man nodded and said, "He's still breathing." Detective Zhao kicked him hard and said, "Then what are you waiting for? Take Mr. Zhang to the doctor." After the two carefully carried the young man away, Detective Zhao looked around and said angrily, "Who did this?" A dead horse lay in the middle of the road. A young man stood in front of the horse's body. Arrestor Zhao estimated the distance between the horse's carcass and them. It was at least 5 to 6 feet away. No wonder young Master Zhang was in such a state. The fact that he didn't fall to his death from such a long distance was already a blessing. Zhang Chen. Thus Chen's Zhang Chen Shan. He looked at the corpse of the horse lying on the ground, and then looked at the iron rod in the youth's hand. He was a little scared, but he forced himself to gather his courage and asked, "Did you do it?" The lad looked at him and said, "He galloped on the street and almost hurt a passerby." "Even so, you can't do that." Detective Zhao raised his voice. "If I don't stop him, his horse will kill someone." The teenager picked up the iron rod with one hand and put it down again. A deep pit appeared on the ground. Detective Zhao looked at the pit on the ground and whispered, But you can't hurt people like that." It was too late. The young man explained, "I only killed the horse. He flew out on his own." Detective Zhao widened his eyes and said, "If you don't kill the horse, will Mr. Zhang be able to fly out?" "I don't care." The youth looked at him, then at the passers-by around them, and said, "I didn't touch him. They can all testify." Detective Zhao had a headache. He looked at him and said, "Even if you didn't kill anyone, it's still wrong to kill a horse. Young hero, why don't you come with us to the yamen and we can talk about it?" The young man shook his head and said, "I won't go. There are no good people in the yamen." Detective Zhao looked at him and said, "Resisting arrest is a serious crime." The young man picked up the iron rod and spun it in his hand. He said, "You guys come. I'm not afraid." The constables around him couldn't help but take a step back. They were afraid. The rod was obviously made of fine iron. When it was waved, it seemed to stir the air around it. Just looking at the mangled horse's head, one could tell how much strength was contained in that strike. They didn't think that their bodies were harder than the horse's head. Even a light scratch would break a few ribs. A constable looked at the woman and the little girl squatting on the ground and suddenly asked, "You were the ones who were almost hit, right?" The little girl nodded and said, "Big brother saved me. Big brother is not a bad person." The constable looked at Detective Zhao, and Detective Zhao immediately understood. He looked at the woman and the little girl and said, "Since this matter is related to you, please come with me." The woman's expression changed. The young man took a step forward and stood in front of them. Detective Zhao's expression darkened. He said, "Are you going to defy the government?" The young man looked down at the mother and daughter, and then at the constables opposite him. He said, "I'll take responsibility for my own actions. It's not their fault. I'll go with you." Detective Zhao smiled and said, "Then I'll have to trouble you to come with us." The young man walked in front with the iron rod in his hand. Detective Zhao looked at the person behind him and said in a low voice, "Watch the mother and daughter. Don't let them escape." Then he pointed at another person and said, "Go to the Zhang mansion and report this." After making the arrangements, he looked up at the young man in front of him and twitched the corner of his mouth disdainfully. Did he really think he was Monkey-san just because he had an iron rod? When they arrived at the yamen, he wanted to see how arrogant he could be. After these people left, the crowd finally began to become noisy again. "Sai, this young man is good at martial arts, but he's too reckless. It's a pity that he offended the Zhang mansion. He shouldn't have gone to the Yamen. He won't be able to get out of that place. The crowd felt sorry for the young man who had stood up at the critical moment with the iron rod in his hand. Behind the crowd, Li looked at Rui beside him and asked, "Am I seeing things? Why is that brat here?" Rui was also a little surprised. Then she shook her head and said, "I don't know what happened to him all these years, but he's really grown up." Li smiled and said, "Although this brat is a little naughty, he's still responsible. Let's go, or he'll suffer." Li nodded and looked in the direction where the constables had disappeared. He couldn't help but sigh. The Son of Heaven. Under the feet of a fairy, such a thing actually happened so brazenly. This martial nephew of his was really not a competent emperor at all. The two followed the constables to the Yamen. At the city gate, Wei Liang, Chen Qing, and Fan Xiao looked at the official road in front of them under the scorching sun. After an unknown amount of time, Fan Xiao couldn't help but wipe his sweat and asked, "Did His Majesty get the time wrong? It's already this hour. Why hasn't Jiang of Silla arrived yet?" Chen Qing also wiped his sweat and said, "Let's wait a little longer." The Zhang mansion. The young man with broken limbs had woken up. However, it was better for him to be unconscious than to wake up. He lay on the bed and howled miserably. In the room, a woman was so sad that tears streamed down her face. She wiped her tears and looked at the middle-aged man beside her and cried, "Master, who beat Chenner up like this? We can't let him go." The middle-aged man walked to the bed with a sullen face and chopped the young man's neck with his hand. The room finally quieted down. He turned to look at the other young man and said, "You handle this matter personally?" "Yes, father." The young man responded and walked out of the room. As he walked out of the mansion, he happened to bump into another person. The young man looked at him and said in surprise, "Where are you going?" "I was just about to find you for a drink. I have some matters to handle." The young man looked at the young man and said, "If you have nothing to do, why don't you come with me?" The young man nodded and said, "Then I have to hurry. My uncle has something to do today and left early. I don't know when he'll be back. I can't let him find out that I've sneaked out." Chapter 1177. Young hero, you are not allowed to bring weapons in the public hall. A constable walked to the young man's side and smiled apologetically. He was about to take away the thick metal rod in the young man's hand. The young man held the metal rod. The constable used all his strength, but the rod didn't budge at all. The constable opened his mouth. "Young hero, this." The young man finally let go. The constable used all his strength to lift the metal rod to the side. His face was flushed, and he looked at the young man with even more fear. A man in an official's robe sat in the court. He slapped the gavel and asked, "Who are you and what crime did you commit?" Detective Zhao took a step forward and bowed. "Lord Zhou, this man committed a crime on the street and killed the steed of the young master of the Zhang family, severely injuring the young master of the Zhang family. I brought him back." The Zhou County magistrates looked at the young man and asked, "What's your name, criminal?" The young man looked at him and said calmly, "Lu Xiaohu." The Zhou County magistrate slapped the gavel again and said loudly, "Criminal Lu Xiaohu, why did you commit a crime on the street?" "He was galloping on the street," the young man explained. "He almost ran into someone. I only injured the horse, not the person." The Zhou County magistrate said angrily, "You directly injured the horse and indirectly injured the person. What's the difference?" "There's a difference," the young man said clearly. "He was galloping on the street, and anyone could have stopped him. I was saving someone, not injuring someone." The Zhou County magistrates was speechless. The young man was stubborn, but what he said made sense. How could anyone be allowed to gallop on the streets of the imperial capital? If the imperial guards encountered him, it wouldn't be too much to shoot him dead on the street. However, the problem was that the person galloping was the young master of the Zhang family. The Zhang family had contributed to the rise of the emperor, and they could do whatever they wanted in the imperial capital. Besides, now that the empress was in power, the bloodline of the Yang dynasty had already been completely exterminated by the dead tyrant. And only Her Majesty the Empress remained. The other half of the next emperor's bloodline would be chosen from an unknown noble family. How could he dare to offend the promising Zhang family? While the Zhou County magistrates were thinking about this, two people walked in from outside. When the court was in session, no one was allowed to walk around. The Zhou County magistrates looked angry. He had just picked up the gavel when he saw the faces of the two men. His heart skipped a beat and he gently put it down. He immediately walked down to the hall and said with a smile, "Mr. Zhang Chen, both of you have graced us with your presence. I apologize for not going out to meet you." This Mr. Zhang was the eldest son of the Zhang family, so he had to treat him with caution. As for the other person, he was even more incredible. Chen Jun Chen was the nephew of Chen Qing, General Chen. General Chen followed the empress from Sangzhou to here, and helped the empress ascend to the throne, so he was highly regarded by the empress. General Chen had no children, so he had always treated this nephew as his own son. Chen Jun's future was naturally limitless. The young man surnamed Zhang looked at the Zhou County magistrates and said indifferently, "My younger brother was assaulted on the street and is heavily injured. Father told me to come here and take a look. Lord Zhou, continue with the trial and don't worry about us." The Zhou County magistrates cursed in his heart. This little bastard said it so easily. What did he mean by don't worry about them? They were already standing here, so how could he not care? He smiled and ordered the bailiff behind him, "Bring 2 chairs for the 2 young masters." Then he walked back to the hall again, slammed the gavel, and said angrily, "Offender Lu Xiaohu, you wantonly hurt people and seriously injured them. Do you admit to your crimes or not?" The young man looked at him and said, "I didn't hurt anyone." "How dare you quibble in front of the eyes of the public, with witnesses and material evidence?" The Zhou County magistrates looked angry. He took out a stick from the bucket, threw it down the hall, and said, 20 strokes first." Lu Xiaohu said unhappily, "I'm not guilty. Why are you hitting me?" 2 bailiffs walked over from his side and pressed down on his shoulders. With a light flick of his hands, he directly threw the 2 bailiffs away. The Zhou County magistrates was shocked and said loudly, "You thief, how dare you cause trouble in the court? Quick, someone come and take him down." More than a dozen government runners rushed forward in a flurry. Naturally, Lu Xiaohu would not give up without putting up a fight. He directly lifted one of them and threw him at them. Immediately, several people were knocked down by him. The rest of the people stood rooted to the ground, not daring to take a step forward. This young man was as strong as a beast. More than 10 people could not hold him down. If they went up, they would only be beaten. Lu Xiaohu walked up to the iron bar, held it with one hand, and stomped it hard on the ground. Everyone felt the court shake. He glanced around and said, "You can all come at me together." Chen Jun and the young man surnamed Zhang sat on the side of the court. Seeing this scene, they could not help but not show panic or anger on their faces. Instead, they laughed. The Zhou County magistrates was not so happy. He was so angry that his voice was trembling. You are rebelling." He looked at the bailiff standing there, not moving forward, and angrily said, "What are you all standing there for? Hurry up and call more people over." There were only dozens of bailiffs in the county government, and not all of them were in the county government. In a short time, only about 20 people gathered. Looking at the young man standing in the court with the iron bar in his hand, no one dared to step forward. The iron bar in his hand was too frightening. He was not a human at all, but a beast. Seeing the stalemate, the Zhou County magistrates immediately walked down to the 2 young men and said awkwardly, "Mr. Zhang, Chen, you see this? It's okay." Chen Jun smiled and said, "The city gate is a few hundred steps away from here. You can ask someone to call the guards here. Isn't that fine?" Hearing this, the Zhou County magistrates was stunned and immediately said, "I'll send someone right now." Chen Jun threw him a token and said with a smile, "It's more convenient to take this." "Thank you, young master." The Zhou County magistrates took the token and handed it to a bailiff. He said, Go ask the guards to help." On the other side, Detective Zhao looked at the young man and said in a trembling voice, You put down that iron bar. You're rebelling. Do you know that you'll be beheaded?" The young man was unmoved. He spun the iron bar with one hand, and the dozens of bailiffs were so scared that they took a step back again. I haven't seen you for a few years. You brat, you've grown up. A voice came from behind. The bailiffs turned around and saw someone coming in. They immediately made way for him. Lu Xiaohu looked at the two figures coming in from outside. He couldn't believe it. After rubbing his eyes, the iron bar in his hand fell to the ground. Ru, Sister Rui, brother-in-law. Li walked over and patted his head. He said, I haven't seen you for so many years. You've grown so tall and strong. The iron bar in Lu Xiaohu's hand fell to the ground. When the two bailiffs saw this, they rushed forward, picked him up, and quickly carried him outside. The Zhou County magistrates looked at the bailiffs who were still in a daze and said loudly, What are you waiting for? Take him down, dead or alive. When the bailiffs heard this, they drew their weapons and rushed forward. Brother-in-law, be careful. Panic finally appeared on Lu Xiaohu's face. He stood in front of Li Yi to protect him. Li Yi smiled and walked in front of him. He grabbed a bailiff's knife and knocked two bailiffs unconscious with the back of the knife. On Rui's side, more than 10 bailiffs had already fallen. When the Zhou County magistrate saw this, his expression changed drastically. He blurted out, He has accomplices. You're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.